Welcome, weary wanderer of the wasteland, to the chronicles of a name that echoes through the ashes of the old world and into the dawn of the new. Tonight, we trace the bloodline that forged the Brotherhood of Steel from the fires of betrayal and loss, following 4 generations of the Maxson family as they shaped the destiny of post-war America. From Captain Roger Maxson's final days in pre-war service to young Arthur's ascension in the Commonwealth, this is a saga of duty, sacrifice, and the weight of legacy carried through irradiated winds. Close your eyes and let the rhythm of history guide you into peaceful slumber as we explore every triumph, every tragedy, and every choice that built an empire of steel and honor from the ruins of civilization. The man who would become the founder of the Brotherhood of Steel was not born to greatness, but forged into it by the grinding machinery of a nation consuming itself in its final desperate years. Captain Roger Maxson entered the autumn of 2076 as a career soldier whose faith in the American dream had already been tested by the resource wars, those bitter conflicts that had revealed the hollow core beneath his country's gleaming surface. He was a man of 40 years, old enough to remember when patriotism felt pure and simple, young enough to still believe that following orders was the same thing as doing right. The summons that would save his life and damn his conscience arrived on a grey October morning, delivered by courier to his quarters in the California desert. Orders marked with classifications so high they seemed to exist in a realm beyond normal military hierarchy, directing Captain Maxson to report to a facility that did not officially exist for duties that could not be discussed even with his wife. The paper felt heavier than it should have in his weathered hands, as if the words themselves carried the weight of secrets too dangerous for ordinary minds to comprehend. Mariposa Military Base rose from the desert like a monument to paranoia, its concrete walls bleached white by the California sun and bristling with defensive positions that suggested its builders feared attack from all directions. The facility had been constructed in haste over the past year, its brutally functional architecture speaking of urgent purpose and unlimited funding. Guard towers stretched toward the sky like steel prayers, their searchlights sweeping endless arcs across sand that held no footprints save those of authorized personnel moving between heavily secured checkpoints. Captain Maxson's first glimpse of his new commanding officer provided little comfort for the unease that had been growing in his chest since receiving his orders. Colonel Robert Spindle was a thin man whose nervous energy seemed to vibrate through his perfectly pressed uniform, his eyes carrying the particular strain that came from knowing too much about things that should not exist. When he spoke, his words came in carefully measured cadences that suggested every syllable had been weighed for security implications before being allowed to escape his lips. The briefing that followed was a masterpiece of revealing nothing while implying everything. Captain Maxson learned that he would be second in command of a security detail protecting research that could determine the outcome of the war with China. He learned that the scientists under their protection were working on biological countermeasures to enemy weapons programs. He learned that absolute secrecy was not merely important but essential to national survival, that the slightest breach of protocol could result in consequences too severe for normal courts-martial to address. What he did not learn was the true nature of the research being conducted in the laboratories beneath Mariposa's innocuous surface, the experiments that would transform his understanding of right and wrong as completely as the bombs that would soon transform the world itself. The forced evolutionary virus existed in those early days only as whispered abbreviations and coded references, its full horror hidden behind layers of compartmentalized security that ensured no single person outside the inner circle could comprehend its implications. The The soldiers under Captain Maxson's command were among the finest the army could provide, handpicked not only for their combat abilities, but for their psychological stability and unwavering loyalty to the chain of command. Sergeant Dennis Allen possessed the kind of easy competence that made complex operations look effortless. Corporal Ben Schilling carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had survived every challenge the wasteland could offer. Private Jensen and Private Soto and Private Camarillo represented the best of their generation. Young men whose dedication to duty had earned them places in an assignment that would test every aspect of their character. The routine that established itself at Mariposa was deceptively normal. The kind of military discipline that had sustained the American armed forces through decades of increasingly desperate conflicts. Guards walked their posts with metronomic precision, their boots echoing through corridors that smelled of fresh concrete and industrial disinfectant. Security protocols were followed with religious devotion, every clipboard signed and countersigned, every visitor logged and escorted, every door locked and checked according to procedures that had been refined through months of careful practice. But beneath the surface of military normalcy, something was growing wrong. The scientists who moved through Mariposa's halls carried themselves with the furtive guilt of people engaged in work that required constant justification, their conversations ending abruptly when soldiers appeared, their laboratory doors remaining locked even to the men charged with their protection. The supplies that arrived under heavy escort included materials that seemed more appropriate for a hospital than a weapons facility, equipment whose purposes remained opaque to observers trained to recognize the tools of conventional warfare. Captain Maxson found himself lying awake during off-duty hours, staring at the ceiling of his quarters while trying to reconcile the official explanations for their mission with the growing evidence that nothing at Mariposa was quite what it seemed. The scientists spoke in euphemisms when they spoke at all, referring to their test subjects as statistical abstractions and their procedures as theoretical models. The security measures were more appropriate for containing something that might escape rather than protecting something that might be stolen. The isolation of Mariposa intensified the psychological pressure that all the personnel experienced as weeks turned into months without meaningful contact with the outside world. Communications with higher command were strictly regulated, limited to operational necessities, and conducted through channels so secure that even the officers responsible for security were excluded from most conversations. The soldiers began to develop the particular kind of tension that came from guarding secrets they were not permitted to understand, protecting people whose work they were forbidden to question. As autumn deepened toward winter, Captain Maxson began to notice changes in the behavior of both his men and the scientists under their protection. The soldiers grew more suspicious and aggressive, their normal camaraderie replaced by the kind of paranoid watchfulness that suggested they no longer trusted even each other completely. The scientists became more secretive and defensive, their already limited interactions with the security detail diminishing to purely professional exchanges conducted with obvious reluctance. The breaking point came on October 10th, 2077, when Private Morrison made a discovery that would shatter the careful fiction that had sustained Mariposa's operations for more than a year. His patrol route had taken him past one of the restricted laboratory sections during a shift change, when normal security protocols were briefly relaxed to allow the transfer of materials between research areas. Through a door that had been left momentarily ajar, Morrison glimpsed something that his mind initially refused to process. A scene so fundamentally wrong that it challenged his understanding of what American soldiers were supposed to protect. The laboratory contained what could only be described as an operating theater, but one equipped for procedures that no legitimate medical facility would ever conduct. Restraint tables bore the unmistakable signs of recent use. their surfaces stained with substances that spoke of operations performed without regard for patient comfort or survival. Monitoring equipment tracked vital signs that were clearly human in origin, while injection apparatus suggested the systematic introduction of substances into living subjects who had no voice in their own treatment. But it was the identity of those subjects that transformed Morrison's horror into something approaching madness. The figures strapped to the tables were not volunteers or criminals or any other category of person whose suffering might be rationalized through military necessity. They were enemy prisoners of war, soldiers who had surrendered in good faith and should have been protected by the same international conventions that guaranteed humane treatment for American captives in Chinese hands. The experiments being conducted represented not just a violation of medical ethics, but a fundamental betrayal of everything the uniform was supposed to represent. Morrison's report to Captain Maxson was delivered in a voice that shook with more than fear, carrying the particular kind of outrage that came from watching sacred principles being violated by the very people charged with upholding them. The details he provided were specific and verifiable, leaving no room for misunderstanding or alternative interpretation. American scientists, working under American military protection, were conducting medical experiments on helpless prisoners with the systematic thoroughness that had once been applied only to laboratory animals. Captain Maxson's first instinct was to dismiss Morrison's report as the product of stress and isolation, the kind of paranoid fantasy that could develop in men pushed beyond their psychological limits by months of unexplained duty. But the private's description of what he had witnessed was too detailed and consistent to be explained away as hallucination, and the behavior of the scientist suddenly made terrible sense when viewed through the lens of guilty knowledge rather than legitimate security concerns. The confrontation with the scientific staff began with Captain Maxson demanding explanations that could reconcile their activities with the legal and moral standards that American forces were supposed to maintain. The responses he received were a mixture of bureaucratic deflection and technical jargon, carefully crafted to avoid direct answers, while implying that classified authorization existed for everything being done. The scientists spoke of national security and wartime necessity, of procedures that had been approved at the highest levels of government and could not be questioned by personnel who lacked appropriate clearance. But Captain Maxson's military training had taught him to recognize evasion and misdirection, skills that served him well when dealing with people whose survival depended on avoiding direct answers to direct questions. The elaborate explanations offered by the scientists contained too many qualifications and exceptions, too many references to authorities who could not be contacted, and procedures that could not be verified. Their guilty behavior was more convincing than their innocent words, and Maxson found himself facing the possibility that Morrison's horrific report was not paranoid fantasy, but simple truth. The breakdown of Colonel Spindle removed the last barrier between Captain Maxson and the terrible knowledge that would define the rest of his life. The commanding officer's retreat into his locked office was accompanied by sounds that spoke of psychological collapse, the kind of mental fracturing that could occur when a person's core beliefs were demolished by irrefutable evidence. The man who had briefed Maxson with such careful precision was revealed to be as much a victim of Mariposa's deceptions as any of his subordinates, his authority based on lies that he had finally been forced to confront. With Colonel Spindle incapacitated and no clear guidance from higher command, Captain Maxson found himself in the position he had never wanted, but had been trained his entire career to assume. The security of Mariposa and everyone within it became his responsibility, but the nature of what he was protecting had been transformed from a vital military asset into a source of moral contamination that threatened to destroy everything he had spent his life defending. The interrogation of Chief Scientist Robert Anderson was conducted with the methodical precision that Captain Maxson had learned during his years of military service, each question designed to elicit information while preventing evasion or misdirection. But Anderson's responses, delivered with the calm assurance of a man who believed his authority was unquestionable, contained confirmations that Maxson had hoped desperately to avoid. The experiments on prisoners of war were not the product of rogue scientists exceeding their authority, but official policy, sanctioned by the highest levels of government, and conducted according to protocols that had been refined through months of systematic practice. The execution of Anderson was not planned but inevitable, the spontaneous reaction of a man whose fundamental beliefs had been shattered by revelations too horrible to process through normal psychological mechanisms. The bullet that ended the chief scientist's life was fired by hands that moved without conscious direction, guided by moral outrage that had overwhelmed rational thought. But the aftermath of that killing would prove to be more significant than the act itself, establishing the precedent that would govern Maxson's treatment of everyone else involved in Mariposa's abominations. Anderson's body was left where it fell as a message to the other scientists, a visual reminder of what awaited those who continued to justify the unjustifiable through appeals to higher authority. The spreading pool of blood beneath the corpse created an atmosphere that made further interrogations unnecessary, encouraging honesty through the simple expedient of demonstrating that lies would no longer be tolerated. The remaining scientists found their tongues remarkably loosened by the sight of their colleagues' remains, their previous evasions replaced by detailed confessions that confirmed every aspect of Morrison's original report. But the truth that emerged from those terror-motivated confessions was worse than anything Captain Maxson had imagined during his darkest speculations about Mariposa's true purpose. The forced evolutionary virus was not simply a biological weapon, but an attempt to transform human nature itself, to create super soldiers who would be capable of winning wars through sheer physical superiority rather than tactical or technological advantage. The prisoners who served as test subjects were being systematically infected with compounds designed to alter their fundamental biology, their suffering measured and recorded as data points in a research program that treated human beings as disposable laboratory equipment. The systematic execution of the remaining scientists proceeded with the grim efficiency that had characterized Captain Maxson's military career, each death serving as both punishment for past crimes and prevention of future atrocities. The men who had devoted their lives to unlocking the secrets of forced evolution found themselves subject to a much simpler form of biological termination, their advanced degrees and government clearances providing no protection against the moral judgment that had been so long delayed. 5 days after Colonel Spindle's breakdown, the locked office door was finally opened to reveal the inevitable conclusion of a man's inability to reconcile his conscience with his duty. The commanding officer's suicide was both shocking and unsurprising, the logical endpoint of psychological pressures that had been building since the first prisoners had been strapped to Mariposa's operating tables. His death removed the last vestige of normal military hierarchy, leaving Captain Maxson as the undisputed authority over a facility that had become a monument to everything wrong with the war effort he had spent his life serving. The attempts to contact higher command that followed Colonel Spindle's death were motivated by desperate hope that someone in authority would be able to provide explanations that could make sense of Mariposa's horrors, that the chain of command would prove to be ignorant of the atrocities rather than complicit in them. But the silence that greeted Maxson's increasingly frantic communications told its own story, revealing a government that either could not or would not acknowledge what was being done in its name. The Declaration of Independence that Captain Maxson eventually broadcast was born not from revolutionary fervor, but from the simple recognition that loyalty to an organization required that organization to be worthy of loyalty. The United States government that had authorized the systematic torture of prisoners of war had forfeited any claim to the allegiance of soldiers who had sworn to protect the innocent and uphold the law. The withdrawal from federal authority was not treason, but the logical response to discovering that federal authority had already withdrawn from the moral principles that justified its existence. But even as Captain Maxson spoke the words that severed his unit's ties to the country they had served, he understood the terrible implications of his decision for the families who had trusted their government to protect them from the consequences of their husbands' and fathers' service. By declaring independence, he had transformed every spouse and child into a potential target, marked them as traitors by association who might be silenced to prevent their testimony about Mariposa's crimes. The orders that brought the soldiers' families to Mariposa were issued with the same methodical precision that had characterized all of Maxson's military decisions, but they carried emotional weight that purely tactical commands had never possessed. These were not strategic movements, but acts of love, desperate attempts to gather the innocent under whatever protection his small force could provide before the government he had served decided that witnesses to its crimes were too dangerous to survive. The families arrived in the shadow of Mariposa's towers during the third week of October, their faces carrying the confusion and fear that came from being uprooted without explanation and brought to a place that their husbands and fathers could not fully describe. The children who played in the facility's secured areas were unaware that they were refugees from their own government, that their presence represented the first step in a transformation that would carry them far from everything they had known into a future that no one could predict. The communication from Leon von Felden that reached Captain Maxson on October 23rd was both the confirmation he had been seeking and the herald of apocalypse he had been dreading. The scientist's voice, crackling through static from the West Tech research facility, provided the final piece of evidence that the horrors of Mariposa were not aberrations but policy, that the government's silence reflected not ignorance but complicity in crimes that violated every principle of civilized warfare. But von Felden's testimony was cut short not by government interference but by something far more final and comprehensive. The line went dead in the middle of a sentence, replaced by the kind of absolute silence that spoke of infrastructure destroyed rather than merely interrupted. In that moment of lost communication, Captain Maxson understood that the war he had been preparing to fight had already begun, that the enemy missiles were already in the air, that everything he had known was about to be erased in nuclear fire. The Great War arrived at Mariposa, not as distant explosions, but as electromagnetic pulses that silenced communication equipment and triggered automatic systems designed to seal the facility against radioactive contamination. The massive doors that had been installed to protect the base from conventional attack proved equally effective against nuclear fallout, creating a secure environment where the families that Maxson had gathered could survive the immediate effects of atomic warfare. But survival was not the same as safety, and Captain Maxson understood that Mariposa's protection was temporary at best. The Chinese targeting priorities that had spared the facility during the first exchange would eventually be corrected, bringing nuclear destruction to a location that contained enough evidence of American war crimes to justify any amount of enemy attention. The concrete walls that had sheltered them from the initial bombing would provide no protection against direct nuclear strikes, and staying would mean waiting to die in a tomb of their own making. The radiation monitoring that Sergeant Plattner volunteered to conduct provided the final piece of information needed to plan their evacuation from Mariposa. The fallout that had been expected to contaminate the surrounding desert had not yet arrived in lethal concentrations, meaning that the families who lacked power armor could travel safely if they moved quickly enough. The window of opportunity was narrow but real, offering a chance for escape that might not come again. The burial of the scientists marked the end of Mariposa's role as a center for research and the beginning of its transformation into a monument to the dangers of unchecked authority. Captain Maxson's insistence on providing proper interment for the men he had executed reflected not forgiveness but recognition that even war criminals deserved basic human dignity in death. The graves were unmarked and unremembered, but they served as the final chapter in a story that had begun with medical progress and ended with moral catastrophe. The sealing of Mariposa was both practical necessity and symbolic gesture, ensuring that the facility's secrets would remain buried while marking the end of one chapter in the lives of everyone who had served there. The massive doors that closed behind Captain Maxson's group would not be opened again for generations, preserving the evidence of government crimes while protecting future explorers from the contamination that still lingered in the facility's deeper levels. The exodus to Lost Hills began with hope and determination, but was marked from its earliest stages by the brutal realities of post-nuclear survival. The T-51 power armor that protected the soldiers provided them with significant advantages in combat and environmental protection, but it could not shield them from the psychological impact of watching their unprotected families suffer the depredations of a world that had suddenly become hostile to all human life. The raiders who attacked the convoy during those first weeks of travel were motivated not by ideology but by simple desperation, transformed by the nuclear holocaust from ordinary citizens into predators who saw other survivors as sources of supplies rather than fellow human beings. Their tactics consistently focused on the weakest members of Maxson's group, understanding that protected soldiers would sacrifice anything to defend their vulnerable families. The casualties that accumulated during the journey to Lost Hills included not only soldiers killed in combat, but family members who succumbed to radiation sickness, exposure, and the countless other dangers that lurked in the post-nuclear wasteland. Each death diminished the group not only in numbers but in morale, creating a psychological burden that threatened to overwhelm even the strongest survivors with grief and despair. Captain Maxson's personal loss came when his wife succumbed to radiation poisoning during the convoy's third week of travel, her death marking the end of the last connection to his pre-war life and completing his transformation from patriotic soldier to post-apocalyptic survivor. The woman who had waited for him through deployments and assignments would not live to see the new world he was trying to build from the ashes of the old, leaving him to carry their shared dreams forward alone. The decision by Sergeant Allen and his companions to break away from the main group reflected the kind of desperate hope that could drive rational people to make irrational choices in desperate circumstances. Their plan to reach West Tech and recover useful technology was not entirely without merit, but it failed to account for the reality that technological salvage was meaningless if the salvagers did not survive to benefit from their discoveries. The silence that surrounded the fate of Allen's splinter group was more ominous than any confirmed report of their deaths would have been, suggesting encounters with dangers too horrible to leave witnesses or remains that could be identified. Their disappearance served as a reminder that the post-nuclear world was filled with threats that could not be overcome through military training or superior equipment, that survival required not only courage, but wisdom about when retreat was preferable to advance. The arrival at Lost Hills Bunker represented both triumph and tragedy for the survivors of Maxson's exodus, their successful completion of the journey overshadowed by the terrible cost in lives and innocence that the trip had demanded. The pre-war government facility that became their new home was empty but intact, its systems still functional, and its supplies still adequate to sustain the small community that would become the foundation of the Brotherhood of Steel. Captain Maxson's declaration of the Brotherhood's founding was delivered not as a speech of conquest, but as a funeral oration for the United States of America, acknowledging that the government they had served was dead and that something new would have to be built from its remains. The name he chose for their new organization reflected both their military heritage and their commitment to strength that could not be broken by the same forces that had destroyed the old world. The transformation from military unit to religious order was gradual but inevitable, driven by the need to find meaning in survival that transcended mere biological persistence. The Brotherhood of Steel was conceived not as a government or army, but as a guardian of human knowledge and achievement, dedicated to preserving the best of the past while preventing the worst from being repeated. The early focus on aiding other survivors reflected Captain Maxson's understanding that the Brotherhood's survival depended not on isolation, but on building relationships with other communities that shared their commitment to rebuilding rather than merely scavenging. But the transition toward technological preservation was driven by the growing recognition that humanity's accumulated knowledge was disappearing faster than it could be replaced, threatening to leave future generations in permanent darkness about their own heritage. The satellite communications that allowed Captain Maxson to contact other military units across the continent provided both hope and heartbreak, revealing that pockets of organized resistance had survived the nuclear exchange, while highlighting the vast distances and hostile territory that separated potential allies. The responses that came through the static-filled transmissions spoke of communities struggling with the same challenges that faced the Brotherhood, united in their determination to preserve something worthwhile from the ruins of civilization. Elizabeth Taggarty's acceptance of Brotherhood doctrine represented the first successful expansion of Maxson's vision beyond the original survivors of Mariposa, proving that the ideals that had sustained them through their darkest hours could inspire others who had not shared their specific experiences. Her transformation of the Appalachian military unit into the Brotherhood's first regional chapter established precedents for organization and command that would influence the Order's development for generations. But the challenge of the scorched plague that eventually consumed Taggarty's chapter demonstrated the limitations of Brotherhood doctrine when confronted with threats that could not be overcome through traditional military tactics or technological superiority. The mutagenic disease that infected everything it touched required solutions that the Brotherhood's focus on preservation rather than innovation was ill-equipped to provide. Captain Maxson's refusal to authorize nuclear weapons against the Scorch Beasts reflected his understanding that the same tools that had destroyed the old world could not be trusted to save the new one, that survival required finding alternatives to the destructive impulses that had brought humanity to the brink of extinction. His moral stance cost lives but preserved principles, establishing the Brotherhood's commitment to redemption rather than repetition of past mistakes. The loss of satellite communication with the Appalachian chapter marked the end of the Brotherhood's continental phase and the beginning of its regional focus, forcing the organization to concentrate on building strength in its immediate area rather than attempting to coordinate activities across impossible distances. The silence from the east was eventually broken by reconnaissance missions that confirmed Taggarty's heroic last stand, but the knowledge came too late to influence the outcome. The decades that followed the Brotherhood's founding were marked by gradual expansion and increasing influence throughout the California wasteland, as other survivors discovered that the strange military order offered protection and stability that could not be found elsewhere. But the growth brought challenges as well as opportunities, forcing the Brotherhood to develop policies and procedures for dealing with outsiders who did not share their history or their complete commitment to their mission. Captain Maxson's death from cancer in 2135 marked the end of the Brotherhood's founding era and the beginning of its institutional phase, as the organization he had created faced the challenge of maintaining its identity and purpose without the guidance of the man whose vision had shaped its fundamental character. His final years had been spent not in combat but in contemplation, recording the lessons learned through decades of post-nuclear survival for the benefit of future generations who would inherit the world he had helped to preserve. The title of Great Deliverer that was posthumously bestowed upon Roger Maxson reflected not only his role in founding the Brotherhood, but his success in transforming a group of traumatized soldiers into the guardians of humanity's future. His legacy lived not in monuments or statues, but in the living institution that continued to grow and adapt long after his death, carrying his vision forward through challenges he could never have anticipated. The man who had begun his final assignment as a loyal captain in the United States Army had ended his life as the founder of something entirely new, an organization that combined the best traditions of military service with a deeper commitment to protecting and preserving everything that made human civilization worth defending. His journey from obedient soldier to moral revolutionary had been completed, but the institution he created would carry that transformation forward through generations yet unborn, ensuring that the lessons learned at Mariposa would never be forgotten and the mistakes that had destroyed the old world would never be repeated. The cancer that claimed Roger Maxson's life in 2135 was a slow and methodical killer, eating away at the founder of the Brotherhood of Steel with the same patient determination that had characterized his own approach to building something lasting from the ashes of the old world. His final months were spent not in the field where he had found his purpose, but in the sterile medical bay of Lost Hills Bunker, surrounded by the hum of machines that could prolong life, but could not restore the strength that had carried him through decades of impossible challenges. The man who lay dying in that narrow bed bore little resemblance to the vigorous captain who had led his soldiers and their families across the wasteland 30 years earlier. The radiation exposure that had been unavoidable during the exodus from Mariposa had finally claimed its due, transforming healthy tissue into malignant growths that spread through his body with the inexorable patience of entropy itself. But his mind remained sharp until the end, filled with concerns not for his own fate but for the future of the organization that had become his life's work. Roger's final conversations with his son were conducted in whispers that barely carried beyond the medical bay's walls, private conferences between a dying father and the young man who would inherit not only the Maxson name, but the terrible burden of leadership in a world that remained hostile to everything the Brotherhood represented. These were not sentimental exchanges, but practical discussions about the challenges that lay ahead, the decisions that would need to be made, the principles that must not be compromised regardless of the pressure that circumstances might bring to bear. The boy who would become known as Maxson II had been shaped by experiences that no child should have endured. His earliest memories dominated not by the normal pleasures of childhood, but by the horror of watching civilization collapse around him. He had been barely 16 when the Great War transformed his world from one of comfortable security to one of constant danger, old enough to understand what was being lost but too young to do anything, except follow where stronger adults led him. The journey from Mariposa to Lost Hills had carved itself into the boy's memory with perfect clarity. Each day of that terrible trek preserved in his mind like photographs taken with light too harsh for normal vision. He remembered the weight of the pack he had carried, loaded with supplies that meant the difference between life and death for his family and their companions. He remembered the sound of his mother's labored breathing during the nights when radiation sickness made sleep impossible for anyone who tried to comfort her. Most clearly of all, he remembered the morning when she did not wake up, when the woman who had given him life became another casualty of the world's ending. The psychological impact of losing his mother to the wasteland's casual cruelty had marked the boy in ways that would influence every decision he made as an adult. Where his father had emerged from Mariposa's revelations with a sense of mission that transcended personal loss, the son had developed a profound wariness of the outside world that made him reluctant to expose the Brotherhood to unnecessary risks. The woman who had died protecting him from raiders had taught him through her death that safety lay only within the walls that could be defended, that opening those walls to strangers was an invitation to tragedy. The transformation of the teenager who had helped bury his mother into the man who would lead the Brotherhood for 3 decades was gradual but inexorable, shaped by years of training and indoctrination that prepared him for responsibilities he had never sought but could not avoid. His progression through the ranks from initiate to knight to paladin was marked not by ambition but by competence. His advancement, driven by others' recognition of his capabilities rather than his own desire for power or prestige. But the burden of the Maxson name carried expectations that went beyond normal military promotion, creating pressure that followed the young man through every stage of his development within the Brotherhood's hierarchy. He was not simply another paladin, but the son of the founder, the heir to a legacy that had already begun to take on mythological proportions in the minds of Brotherhood members who had not personally known Roger Maxson, but revered his memory as the great deliverer who had saved them from the fate of the outside world. The internal debate that raged within Maxson II throughout his adult life reflected the fundamental tension between his father's outward-looking vision and his own hard-won understanding of the world's beau dangus. Roger Maxson had believed that the Brotherhood's mission required engagement with other survivors, that the preservation of knowledge and technology could only be accomplished through building relationships with communities that shared their basic commitment to rebuilding rather than merely scavenging. But the son who had watched his mother die at the hands of post-war raiders saw such engagement as a luxury that the Brotherhood could not afford, a dangerous indulgence that threatened the security of the only safe haven left in a world gone mad. The ascension to High Elder that came with his father's death in 2135 was both inevitable and unwelcome, the culmination of decades of preparation for a role that required him to set aside personal preferences in favor of institutional needs. At 60 years of age, Maxson II possessed the experience and wisdom necessary for leadership, but lacked the visionary enthusiasm that had driven his father's expansion of Brotherhood influence throughout the California wasteland. His was a more conservative temperament, focused on consolidation rather than growth, on preservation rather than innovation. The 3 decades of his leadership that followed were marked by careful expansion and methodical organization, as the Brotherhood under his guidance became less of a revolutionary movement and more of an established institution with formal procedures and standardized practices. The informal relationships that had characterized the organization's early years gave way to structured hierarchies and codified protocols, creating stability at the cost of some of the passionate commitment that had sustained the original survivors through their darkest hours. But Maxson II's cautious approach to leadership proved remarkably effective in building the foundation that would allow the Brotherhood to survive and prosper long after the death of its founding generation. His emphasis on training and preparation created military capabilities that far exceeded what the organization's small numbers might have suggested, while his focus on technological development provided advantages that compensated for their lack of manpower when dealing with external threats. The establishment of formal relationships with outside communities during his reign represented a compromise between his father's vision of active engagement and his own preference for isolation, creating trade partnerships and mutual defense agreements that provided the Brotherhood with necessary resources while minimizing their exposure to the political complications that came with deeper involvement in wasteland affairs. These arrangements allowed the organization to benefit from contact with other survivors without becoming dependent on them for essential needs. The discovery and initial development of relationships with the Hub during this period exemplified Maxson II's approach to external affairs, as the Brotherhood provided security and technological assistance to the struggling trading center in exchange for access to resources and information that would have been difficult to obtain through other means. The partnership benefited both communities while maintaining the careful distance that allowed each to preserve their independence and unique character. The growing threat of the Vipers during the later years of Maxson II's reign represented exactly the kind of external danger that his cautious policies had been designed to anticipate and counter. The snake-worshipping cult that had emerged from the chaos of post-war California combined religious fanaticism with tactical cunning, creating an enemy that could not be reasoned with or bought off, but had to be confronted through direct military action. The intelligence reports that reached Lost Hills regarding Viper activities painted a picture of an organization that had evolved from desperate scavengers into a coordinated threat capable of challenging established settlements throughout the region. Their raids were conducted with increasing sophistication and brutality, targeting not only material resources, but the psychological security that allowed other communities to maintain hope for eventual recovery from the war's devastation. The decision to take personal command of reconnaissance missions against the Vipers reflected both Maxson II's sense of duty and his understanding that the Brotherhood's technological advantages meant little if they were not employed by leaders who understood how to use them. Effectively, at 90 years of age, he remained capable of field operations thanks to the life support systems built into his power armor. But his advanced years made him vulnerable in ways that younger warriors did not face. The morning of his final mission dawned clear and cold in the California desert, with the kind of crisp air that made distant objects seem closer than they actually were and carried sounds farther than normal across the empty landscape. Maxson II emerged from his power armor's environmental systems into the natural atmosphere for what he believed would be a brief moment of refreshment, a chance to experience the world directly, rather than through filtered air and electronic displays. The arrow that killed him was fired by a Viper cultist whose religious fervor had been enhanced by the desperate knowledge that his people faced extinction at the hands of the Brotherhood's systematic campaign against their organization. The poison tip that penetrated Maxson's throat was not the product of advanced technology, but of ancient techniques, refined through generations of practice, proving that primitive weapons could still find their mark against even the most sophisticated defenses when wielded with skill and determination. The hours that followed the arrow's impact were marked by the gradual failure of biological systems that no amount of medical technology could repair. As toxins spread through Maxson II's bloodstream with methodical efficiency, his final words were not expressions of regret or fear, but practical instructions for his subordinates, ensuring that the Brotherhood's mission would continue even after his death had removed another link to the organization's founding generation. The news of their High Elder's death reached Lost Hills through radio transmissions that crackled with static and emotion, carrying not only the bare facts of his passing, but the rage and determination of the soldiers who had witnessed their leader's fall to a primitive weapon wielded by fanatics who had already proven their willingness to die for their proven, twisted beliefs. The response that followed would demonstrate that the Brotherhood's commitment to protecting their own exceeded even their normal dedication to preserving life and maintaining order in the wasteland. Head Paladin Rhombus assumed command of Brotherhood forces with the cold fury of a professional soldier who understood that leadership sometimes required decisions that were morally complex but tactically necessary. His first orders were directed not toward funeral arrangements or succession planning, but toward the mobilization of every available asset for a campaign of retribution that would make the Viper's destruction of their High Elder seem like a minor provocation in comparison to what would follow. The war that ensued was not the measured response that Maxson II might have authorized, but something closer to a crusade, driven by grief and anger. that had been focused into a weapon more devastating than any technology the Brotherhood possessed. Every patrol became a hunting party. Every reconnaissance mission became a search and destroy operation. Every contact with Viper forces became an opportunity to demonstrate that killing a Maxson carried consequences that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. The Brotherhood's advantages in technology, training, and organization proved overwhelming when applied with the systematic thoroughness that Rhombus brought to his campaign of vengeance. Laser weapons that could burn through human flesh with surgical precision were employed not for their efficiency, but for their psychological impact, creating casualties that served as warnings to other cultists about the fate that awaited anyone who threatened Brotherhood leadership. Power armor that had been designed to protect soldiers in conventional warfare became the instrument of a genocidal campaign that pursued Viper survivors across the entire California wasteland, following them into caves and ruins and settlements where they sought refuge, eliminating not only active combatants, but anyone who had provided assistance or shelter to the organization responsible for their High Elder's death. The systematic nature of the Brotherhood's response reflected not only their military capabilities, but their institutional memory of other threats that had been allowed to escape and regroup, creating future problems that could have been avoided through more thorough initial action. The lesson that Rhombus drew from Maxson II's death was not that caution was necessary, but that mercy was dangerous, that enemies who were allowed to survive would inevitably return to threaten Brotherhood interests again. The few Vipers who managed to escape the initial phases of the campaign found themselves pursued by hunter-killer teams that tracked them across hundreds of miles of hostile terrain, following trails that grew fainter with each passing day, but never disappeared entirely. These final survivors were not simply defeated, but hunted to extinction, their deaths serving not only practical purposes but symbolic ones, demonstrating that the Brotherhood's reach extended throughout the wasteland and that no enemy could escape their justice indefinitely. The mountains that sheltered the last Viper strongholds became killing grounds where advanced technology was employed against primitive weapons with results that were never in doubt, only delayed by the defenders' knowledge of local terrain and their willingness to die fighting rather than surrender to an enemy that had already demonstrated its commitment to their complete extinction. The final battles were brief and decisive, ending organized Viper resistance forever and reducing a once threatening organization to scattered individuals who posed no significant danger to anyone. The discovery of the hub during the later phases of the anti-Viper campaign provided an unexpected benefit from what had begun as purely punitive operations, as Brotherhood patrols following fleeing cultists encountered a trading settlement that offered opportunities for the kind of mutually beneficial relationship that both communities needed for long-term prosperity. The initial contact was conducted with the wariness that characterized all of the Brotherhood's external relationships, but the potential advantages of trade and cooperation quickly became apparent to leaders on both sides. The establishment of formal relations between Lost Hills and the Hub represented the first major diplomatic success of the post-Maxson era, creating precedents for interaction with outside communities that would influence Brotherhood policy for generations. The agreement that emerged from months of careful negotiation provided the Brotherhood with access to resources and information that were difficult to obtain through other means, while giving the Hub the security and technological assistance that enabled its transformation from struggling outpost to major commercial center. The legacy that Maxson II left to his successors was complex and sometimes contradictory, reflecting both his personal caution and the institutional momentum that had been created by his father's more expansive vision. His 3 decades of leadership had consolidated the Brotherhood's position in the California wasteland while building the organizational structure that would enable future growth. But his reluctance to take risks had also limited the scope of what the organization might have achieved under more aggressive leadership. The example of his death served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of assuming that technological superiority provided complete protection against determined enemies, while simultaneously demonstrating the price that would be paid by anyone who dared to strike at Brotherhood leadership. The campaign of retribution that followed his assassination established the organization's reputation for thorough and merciless response to threats against their core interests, creating a deterrent effect that would influence the behavior of potential enemies for decades to come. The loss of direct connection to the Brotherhood's founding generation that came with Maxson II's death marked the end of an era and the beginning of a new phase in the organization's development, as leadership passed to individuals who had been shaped by institutional culture rather than personal experience of the journey from Mariposa to Lost Hills. These new leaders inherited not only the Brotherhood's accumulated strength and knowledge, but the responsibility for interpreting and implementing the vision of men who had lived through the world's ending and emerged from that experience with unshakable commitment to preventing its repetition. The transformation of Maxson II from reluctant heir to respected leader to martyred elder reflected the broader evolution of the Brotherhood itself, from revolutionary movement to established institution, as the organization that had been born from betrayal and trauma matured into something capable of providing stability and continuity in a world that desperately needed both. His death marked not the end of the Maxson legacy, but its transformation from personal inheritance to institutional tradition, ensuring that the name would continue to influence Brotherhood policy and culture long after the last member of the founding family had joined their ancestors, in whatever peace awaited beyond the struggles of the wasteland. The man who had spent his childhood watching civilization collapse and his adulthood building something better from its remains had completed his own transformation from survivor to guardian, leaving behind an organization that combined the best traditions of military service with a deeper commitment to preserving everything that made human existence meaningful. His grave in the Lost Hills Cemetery was marked not with elaborate monuments, but with simple stone that bore only his name and dates, reflecting the Brotherhood's understanding that true legacy lived not in memorials, but in the continued success of the mission that had given meaning to his life and purpose to his death. The silence that followed the news of Maxson II's death was not the respectful quiet of mourning, but the terrible stillness that precedes a storm of unprecedented violence. Within the corridors of Lost Hills bunker, the normal rhythms of Brotherhood life ceased, as soldiers who had served under their High Elder for decades struggled to process the reality that their legendary leader had been felled by a primitive weapon wielded by cultists they had dismissed as little more than organized scavengers. The arrow that had found its mark through a moment's carelessness had not simply killed a man, but had struck at the very heart of the organization's sense of invulnerability. Head Paladin Rhombus received the report of his commander's death through radio transmissions that crackled with static and barely controlled rage, the voices of the survivors painting a picture of an ambush that had succeeded not through superior tactics or overwhelming force, but through the simple expedient of patience and poison. The Viper cultist who had fired the fatal shot had waited motionless for hours among the rocks, his body painted with desert camouflage and his breathing controlled to near invisibility, until the moment when the Brotherhood's most important leader made the fatal mistake of removing his helmet for a breath of unfiltered air. The reaction that swept through Lost Hills in the hours following confirmation of Maxson II's death was unlike anything the Brotherhood had experienced since the dark days of their exodus from Mariposa 40 years earlier. Warriors who had faced deathclaws and super mutants without flinching found themselves shaking with fury at the thought that their High Elder had been murdered by fanatics who worshipped snakes and lived in caves, whose entire worldview was based on primitive superstitions that had no place in the technological renaissance the Brotherhood represented. Rhombus himself felt the weight of temporary command settle on his shoulders like power armor, whose servos had failed, creating a burden that was almost impossible to bear but could not be set aside or shared with others. The man who had spent decades following orders found himself in the position of giving them, responsible not only for the immediate tactical response to their leader's assassination, but for the broader strategic decisions that would determine whether the Brotherhood emerged from this crisis stronger or weaker than before. The first orders that Rhombus issued were deceptively simple, calling for the mobilization of every available combat unit and the suspension of all non-essential activities until further notice. But the implications of these commands were understood by every soldier who received them, transforming the Brotherhood's entire operational structure from one focused on defense and preservation to one dedicated entirely to the systematic destruction of an enemy that had proven itself capable of striking at their most protected leaders. The arsenal that Lost Hills contained represented decades of careful accumulation and maintenance, weapons and equipment that had been preserved from the old world or manufactured in the Brotherhood's own workshops to standards that far exceeded anything available to other wasteland communities. Laser rifles that could burn through human flesh with surgical precision were removed from storage lockers where they had waited for enemies worthy of their power. Plasma weapons that could reduce a human being to component atoms were charged and calibrated by armorsmiths, who understood that they were preparing instruments not just of war but of annihilation. The power armor that had protected Brotherhood soldiers through countless engagements against raiders and mutants was modified with additional ammunition storage and enhanced communication systems, transforming each warrior into a mobile weapons platform capable of operating independently for extended periods, while maintaining contact with command elements that would coordinate their movements across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. The familiar weight of T-45 and T-51B suits became not just protection but the physical embodiment of the Brotherhood's technological superiority over enemies who relied on crude weapons and primitive tactics. The intelligence reports that had been accumulating about Viper activities throughout the California wasteland suddenly took on new significance as Rhombus and his staff officers began planning operations that would require precise knowledge of enemy positions, capabilities, and escape routes. Maps that had been marked with suspected cultist camps were transformed into target lists for elimination, while informants who had provided occasional information about Viper movements found themselves questioned with the intensity of military interrogators seeking actionable intelligence for immediate use. The transformation of individual Brotherhood soldiers from protectors to hunters was accomplished through briefings that emphasized not the defensive nature of their mission, but its preventive aspects. The necessity of eliminating an enemy that had demonstrated its ability to threaten Brotherhood leadership and would certainly attempt to repeat its success if given the opportunity. The psychological preparation for what was essentially a campaign of extermination was accomplished through appeals to loyalty, duty, and the practical necessity of ensuring that such attacks could never be repeated. The first patrols that departed Lost Hills in pursuit of Viper cultists were equipped not for reconnaissance or negotiation, but for the systematic elimination of every enemy they encountered, their orders leaving no room for prisoners or survivors who might escape to warn other camps about the Brotherhood's approach. The soldiers who marched into the California desert carried with them not only advanced weapons but the collective fury of an organization that had seen its most revered leader struck down by enemies they had considered beneath serious attention. The initial engagements between Brotherhood forces and Viper cultists were less battles than executions, as primitive weapons and fanatical courage proved inadequate against opponents who possessed overwhelming advantages in firepower, protection, and tactical coordination. Laser beams that could cut through human bodies with microscopic precision created casualties that served not only tactical purposes but psychological ones, demonstrating to any survivors the futility of resistance against enemies who commanded the very forces of nature. The camps that had sheltered Viper families and non-combatants burned with fires that could be seen for miles across the desert, their smoke columns serving as signals to other cultists that the Brotherhood's response to their leader's assassination would be measured not in terms of proportional retaliation, but complete annihilation. The systematic destruction of everything associated with the snake-worshipping cult extended beyond military targets to include the infrastructure that had supported their way of life, ensuring that even survivors would find no refuge in locations that had once provided safety. The pursuit of fleeing cultists across the wasteland became a grim exercise in tracking and elimination, as Brotherhood soldiers followed trails that led through some of the most dangerous terrain in post-war California. The skills that had been developed through years of hunting mutants and raiders were applied with methodical precision to enemies who possessed intimate knowledge of local geography, but lacked the equipment and training necessary to evade. Hunters equipped with advanced sensors and unlimited ammunition. The mountain strongholds where Viper leadership had established their most secure positions became the sites of sieges that demonstrated the Brotherhood's ability to project power across vast distances and overcome defensive advantages through superior technology and tactical coordination. Artillery pieces that had been salvaged from pre-war military installations were transported across impossible terrain and employed against targets that had been considered unreachable by conventional forces, proving that no location was too remote or too well defended to escape the Brotherhood's vengeance. The psychological impact of the Brotherhood's campaign extended far beyond the immediate tactical results, creating a reputation for thorough and merciless response to threats that would influence the behavior of potential enemies for decades to come. Communities throughout the wasteland learned that attacking Brotherhood personnel carried consequences that extended beyond the immediate military situation, that the organization's technological advantages would be employed without restraint against anyone who dared to strike at their leadership. But the campaign's most significant discovery came not through planned operations but through the accident of pursuit, as Brotherhood forces following fleeing cultists encountered a struggling trading settlement that represented exactly the kind of opportunity for mutually beneficial cooperation that their fallen High Elder had envisioned. The hub's location at the intersection of several major caravan routes made it potentially valuable as a source of information and resources, while its obvious need for security assistance created possibilities for the kind of relationship that could benefit both communities. The initial contact between Brotherhood representatives and hub leadership was conducted with the wariness that characterized all of the organization's external relationships, as both sides sought to evaluate the potential benefits and risks of closer cooperation. The merchants who controlled the settlement's affairs were impressed by the Brotherhood's obvious military capabilities, but concerned about the implications of associating with an organization that was currently engaged in what appeared to be a campaign of genocide against another wasteland community. The negotiations that followed were complicated by the hub's need to maintain neutrality in conflicts that did not directly affect their commercial interests, while the Brotherhood sought assurances that their new trading partner would not provide assistance to enemies who might threaten Brotherhood personnel or installations. The agreement that eventually emerged represented a compromise that satisfied both parties' essential requirements, while establishing precedents for future cooperation between the two communities. The formal establishment of trade relations between Lost Hills and the Hub provided the Brotherhood with access to resources that were difficult or impossible to obtain through other means, while giving the trading settlement the security guarantees that enabled its transformation from struggling outpost to major commercial center. Caravans that had previously avoided the area due to security concerns began routing through hub territory, bringing goods and information from across the wasteland to merchants who were now under Brotherhood protection. The military benefits of the partnership proved as significant as the economic ones, as hub traders provided intelligence about conditions throughout the California wasteland that enabled Brotherhood forces to locate and eliminate the remaining Viper strongholds with increased efficiency. The commercial networks that connected the hub to other settlements became sources of information about cultist movements and activities, allowing the Brotherhood to anticipate and counter enemy operations before they could be fully implemented. The final phases of the anti-Viper campaign were marked by increasingly desperate resistance from cultists who understood that they faced not defeat but extinction, their religious fervor intensified by the knowledge that surrender would not save them from the fate that had already claimed their comrades. The battles that marked the end of organized Viper resistance were characterized by the fanatical courage of defenders who fought with the intensity of people who had nothing left to lose, and enemies who showed no inclination toward mercy or negotiation. The last Viper stronghold fell on a morning when the desert air was thick with smoke from burning camps and the screams of the dying, as Brotherhood forces employed flame weapons and explosives to eliminate defenders who had retreated into cave systems that conventional firearms could not reach effectively. The systematic clearing of the underground complex required techniques that had been developed for dealing with other subterranean threats, but the application of these methods to human enemies created moral complexities that were addressed through appeals to military necessity and the prevention of future attacks. The silence that followed the fall of the final Viper position was different from the anticipatory quiet that had preceded the campaign, carrying instead the weight of completion and the satisfaction of objectives achieved through overwhelming application of superior force. The snake-worshipping cult that had murdered their High Elder had been reduced from an organized threat to scattered individuals whose survival depended on their ability to blend into other communities and abandon the beliefs that had defined their identity. The few cultists who managed to escape the Brotherhood's systematic elimination campaign found themselves hunted by specialized teams that pursued them across hundreds of miles of wasteland terrain, following trails that grew fainter with each passing day, but never disappeared entirely. These final survivors were not simply defeated, but eliminated with the thoroughness that characterized all Brotherhood operations, their deaths serving both practical and symbolic purposes in demonstrating that no enemy could escape justice indefinitely. The mountains that had sheltered the Viper leadership became monuments to the Brotherhood's capacity for sustained military operations across difficult terrain, their peaks marked by the smoke of burned settlements and the silence of communities that had been erased as completely as if they had never existed. The systematic nature of the destruction served not only immediate tactical purposes but longer-term strategic ones, creating object lessons about the consequences of threatening Brotherhood interests that would be remembered by potential enemies for generations. The transformation of head Paladin Rhombus from temporary commander to the architect of genocide reflected the broader changes that the crisis had created within Brotherhood culture. As an organization that had been founded on principles of preservation and protection, demonstrated its willingness to employ the most extreme measures when its core interests were threatened. The moral complexities of the campaign were addressed through institutional mechanisms that emphasized duty, loyalty, and the practical necessity of deterring future attacks against Brotherhood leadership. The legacy of Maxson, the Second's assassination, and the campaign of retribution that followed would influence Brotherhood policy and culture for decades, establishing precedents for response to threats that would be remembered and referenced whenever similar situations arose. The organization that emerged from the Viper Wars was stronger and more secure than before, but it was also harder and less forgiving, shaped by the understanding that mercy toward enemies was a luxury that could not be afforded when the stakes included the survival of everything they had built. The establishment of the hub as a major trading partner represented the campaign's most positive outcome, creating economic and intelligence-gathering opportunities that would benefit the Brotherhood for generations, while demonstrating that their military capabilities could be employed in service of diplomatic as well as destructive objectives. The relationship that developed between the two communities provided a model for future cooperation with outside groups, showing that the Brotherhood's technological advantages could be leveraged to create mutually beneficial arrangements with settlements that shared their basic commitment to order and stability. The name of Maxson II became permanently associated with the transformation of the Brotherhood from defensive organization to active force for order throughout the California wasteland, his death serving as the catalyst for changes that established the group's reputation as protectors of civilization and implacable enemies of those who would threaten the innocent. The legacy of his assassination lived not only in the institutional memory of the Brotherhood, but in the practical understanding that attacks against their leadership would be met with responses of unprecedented scope and intensity. The completion of the Viper Wars marked the end of the Brotherhood's founding period and the beginning of their establishment as a major power in post-war California. Their demonstrated ability to project force across vast distances and eliminate organized threats, creating a reputation that would influence the behavior of potential enemies and allies throughout the region. The organization that had begun as a group of traumatized soldiers fleeing government betrayal had evolved into something capable of shaping the political and military landscape of the entire wasteland. Their technological advantages and institutional discipline, creating capabilities that far exceeded what their numbers might suggest. The death of Maxson II left the Brotherhood of Steel in a position that no amount of military planning or institutional preparation had anticipated, facing not only the loss of their revered leader, but the absence of any clear successor who possessed both the necessary qualifications and the unquestioned authority to assume command of an organization that had grown far beyond what its both founders had ever envisioned. The Elder Council that convened in the aftermath of the High Elder's assassination was forced to confront questions that went to the heart of their institutional identity, examining whether leadership of the Brotherhood was a hereditary right or an earned privilege that required demonstration of competence before it could be bestowed. John Maxson stood before the assembled elders as a man of 58 years whose entire adult life had been shaped by the expectations and burdens that came with bearing the name of the Brotherhood's founding family. Unlike his father and grandfather, who had been forged by the crucible of world-ending catastrophe and the desperate struggle for survival that followed, John had been born into an organization that already possessed clear purpose and established procedures. His childhood spent within the secure walls of Lost Hills Bunker, rather than the dangerous wasteland that had claimed so many of his family's generation. The education that John had received as the heir to the Maxson legacy was comprehensive and rigorous, covering not only the military and technical skills that all Brotherhood members were expected to master, but the broader knowledge of history, politics, and human nature that would be necessary for anyone who might someday be called upon to guide the organization through challenges that could not be resolved through superior firepower alone. His instructors had been the Brotherhood's finest scholars and warriors, men and women who understood that they were preparing not just another soldier, but the potential future of everything they had built. But the weight of inherited expectations had created in John a complex relationship with the leadership role that everyone assumed he would eventually assume. torn between genuine dedication to the Brotherhood's mission and resentment at having his life's path determined by circumstances of birth rather than personal choice. The young man who had excelled in every test and exceeded every benchmark set for his development had done so not from burning ambition, but from the understanding that failure to meet the standards expected of a Maxson would bring shame, not only on himself, but on the memory of men who had died to create the world in which he lived. The progression through the Brotherhood's ranks that John had followed was technically identical to that required of any other member, from initiate to knight to paladin, but the reality of his advancement was complicated by the knowledge that his superiors were evaluating not just his individual performance, but his suitability for responsibilities that would eventually extend far beyond normal military duties. Every mission became a test of leadership potential. Every decision scrutinized for evidence of the wisdom and judgment that would be necessary for guiding the Brotherhood through an uncertain future. The relationships that John had formed with his fellow Brotherhood members were marked by the same complexity that characterized every aspect of his life within the organization, as genuine friendships were complicated by the understanding that he might someday be in a position to give orders to men and women who had once been his peers and companions. The careful balance between maintaining normal social connections and preserving the authority that future leadership would require created a form of isolation that was less obvious, but perhaps more profound than the physical dangers that had shaped previous generations of his family. The one genuine friendship that John had managed to develop outside the Brotherhood's insular community was with Butch Harris, the owner and operator of Fargo Traders, a small but successful caravan company that had built its reputation on reliable service and fair dealing throughout the California wasteland. The relationship that had begun as routine commercial interaction had evolved into something approaching genuine personal connection, providing John with a perspective on the world beyond Lost Hills that was neither filtered through Brotherhood doctrine nor complicated by institutional politics. Butch Harris represented everything that John found appealing about life outside the Brotherhood's structured environment. A man whose success had been earned through personal effort and business acumen rather than inherited position, whose daily concerns revolved around practical problems of profit and loss rather than abstract questions of duty and legacy. The conversations they shared during Harris's visits to Lost Hills or John's occasional ventures into the wasteland provided glimpses of a life that was defined by personal choice rather than institutional obligation, creating a contrast that made John's own circumstances seem simultaneously privileged and constrained. The Elder Council's deliberations regarding John's readiness for supreme leadership extended over months of careful evaluation. As the men and women responsible for the Brotherhood's institutional continuity weighed the benefits of maintaining the Maxson dynasty against the risks of promoting someone whose qualifications remained largely theoretical rather than proven through independent command. The precedent that their decision would establish would influence the organization's approach to succession for generations, determining whether the Brotherhood would become a hereditary monarchy or a meritocracy based on demonstrated competence. The concerns that some elders expressed about John's suitability for leadership reflected not doubts about his intelligence or dedication, but questions about whether his sheltered upbringing within the Brotherhood's protective environment had adequately prepared him for the psychological and political challenges that came with making decisions that could determine the survival or destruction of everything they had built. The man who had excelled in controlled training exercises and routine patrol duties had never faced the kind of crisis that would test his ability to function effectively under the pressure of ultimate responsibility. The compromise that eventually emerged from the Elder Council's deliberations reflected the organization's institutional wisdom and its understanding that leadership could not be granted, but had to be earned through demonstrated performance in positions of increasing responsibility. John's promotion to the Elder Council itself, rather than directly to the position of High Elder, provided a structure for evaluating his readiness for supreme command, while allowing him to gain experience in the kind of high-level decision-making that would be required if he eventually assumed his father's role. The 4 years that John spent serving on the Elder Council provided him with insights into the complexity of governing an organization that had evolved far beyond its original conception as a simple military unit dedicated to preserving technology and protecting survivors. The decisions that came before the council ranged from routine administrative matters to fundamental questions about the Brotherhood's relationship with outside communities, each choice carrying implications that would influence the organization's development for years or decades to come. The political dynamics within the Elder Council revealed aspects of Brotherhood culture that had been invisible to John during his progression through the military ranks, showing him how personal ambitions and institutional loyalties could conflict with the organization's stated mission in ways that required constant vigilance and careful management. The men and women who served alongside him possessed decades of experience in balancing competing interests and managing resources that were always insufficient for achieving everything they hoped to accomplish. The gradual development of John's skills as a political leader paralleled his growing understanding of the burdens that came with ultimate authority, as he observed firsthand how the decisions made in the council chambers affected the lives of individual Brotherhood members and their families. The abstract concepts of duty and responsibility that had been central to his education took on concrete meaning as he watched the consequences of policy choices play out in the daily experiences of people whose welfare depended on the wisdom and competence of their leadership. The invitation to assume the role of High Elder, when it finally came, was extended not with ceremony or celebration, but with the quiet formality that characterized all important Brotherhood business, reflecting the organization's understanding that leadership was a burden to be accepted rather than an honor to be celebrated. John's response to the offer was complicated by his awareness that accepting would mean the end of his friendship with Butch Harris and his connection to the world beyond Lost Hills, as the demands of Supreme Command would make such personal relationships impossible to maintain. The reluctance that John displayed in accepting the position of High Elder was interpreted by some observers as appropriate humility, and by others as evidence of his unsuitability for the role, but the reality was more complex than either interpretation suggested. The man who had spent his entire life preparing for this moment understood better than anyone else the weight of responsibility he was being asked to assume, the knowledge that his decisions would shape the lives of thousands of people and potentially determine the Brotherhood's survival or extinction. The transformation of John from reluctant candidate to acknowledged leader was accomplished through ceremonies that emphasized continuity with the past, while recognizing the challenges of the future, as the third generation of Maxson leadership assumed responsibility for an organization that had grown far beyond what its founders had envisioned. The man who stood before his assembled followers during the installation ceremony carried not only his own hopes and fears, but the accumulated expectations of everyone who looked to the Maxson name for guidance and inspiration. The early years of John's leadership were marked by the careful consolidation of his authority and the gradual implementation of policies that reflected his understanding of the Brotherhood's evolving role in the post-war world. The organization that he had inherited possessed significant military capabilities and technological advantages, but it also faced challenges that could not be resolved through superior firepower alone, requiring diplomatic skills and strategic thinking that had not been necessary during the more straightforward conflicts of previous generations. The expansion of trade relationships with settlements throughout the California wasteland reflected John's recognition that the Brotherhood's long-term survival depended on building connections with other communities rather than maintaining the isolation that had characterized their earlier development. The agreements that he negotiated provided the organization with access to resources and information that were essential for continued growth, while establishing the Brotherhood's reputation as a reliable partner for communities that shared their commitment to order and stability. But the most challenging aspect of John's leadership proved to be managing the internal tensions that had developed within the Brotherhood, as it evolved from a small, tightly knit community into a larger and more diverse organization with competing interests and priorities. The growth that had strengthened the Brotherhood militarily had also created political complexities that required constant attention and careful management, as different factions within the organization pursued agendas that sometimes conflicted with the unified vision that had sustained earlier generations. The claims that John began making during his later years about threats gathering in the northern regions of the continent were met with skepticism by many of his subordinates, who interpreted his warnings as evidence of paranoia or declining mental faculties rather than legitimate intelligence about developing dangers. The Elder Council that had once been unified in its support for his leadership began to fragment into factions that questioned his judgment and competence, creating political instability that threatened the organization's ability to respond effectively to external challenges. The intelligence reports that supported John's concerns about northern military developments were fragmentary and difficult to verify, based on radio intercepts, refugee testimonies, and other sources that could not provide the kind of concrete evidence that skeptical elders demanded before committing resources to address potential threats. The pattern of increasing military activity that John detected through careful analysis of multiple information sources was subtle enough to be dismissed as coincidence by those who preferred to focus on more immediate concerns. The growing reputation that John acquired for making unsupported claims about distant threats reflected not mental instability, but his superior understanding of intelligence analysis and strategic planning, skills that had been developed through years of studying the Brotherhood's security situation and the broader political dynamics of post-war America. The man who was dismissed as paranoid by his contemporaries possessed insights into developing dangers that would prove tragically accurate when events finally validated his warnings. The isolation that John experienced during his final years as High Elder was different from the physical dangers that had challenged previous generations of his family, but no less significant in its impact on his psychological well-being and effectiveness as a leader. The man who had once enjoyed the friendship and respect of his subordinates found himself increasingly alone, surrounded by advisors who questioned his judgment and followers who doubted his competence to guide them through the challenges they faced. The vindication that came with the arrival of the Vault Dweller and the revelation of the Master's supermutant army proved that John's warnings about northern threats had been not only accurate but understated, as the scope and sophistication of the enemy forces far exceeded even his most pessimistic projections. The organization that had dismissed his concerns as paranoid fantasies was forced to confront evidence that their High Elder's strategic vision had been correct, while their own skepticism had left them unprepared for the greatest challenge they had ever faced. The alliance between the Brotherhood and the Vault Dweller that developed during the crisis represented the kind of cooperation with outside forces that John had advocated throughout his leadership, demonstrating the value of building relationships with individuals and communities that shared the organization's basic commitment to protecting civilization from the forces that would destroy it. The partnership that emerged from desperate necessity proved more effective than either participant could have achieved independently, combining the Brotherhood's technological advantages with the Vault Dweller's unique capabilities and determination. The campaign against the Master's army that followed was conducted on a scale and with an intensity that exceeded anything the Brotherhood had previously experienced, requiring the organization to deploy its full military capabilities in coordination with allied forces, whose methods and objectives were not entirely compatible with traditional Brotherhood doctrine. The challenges of managing such a complex operation, while maintaining the organization's essential character and mission, tested every aspect of John's leadership abilities and strategic understanding. The role that John played in the eventual victory over the Master's forces was less visible than the contributions of the Vault Dweller and other heroes whose names became legendary throughout the wasteland, but his strategic planning and resource coordination were essential to the success of operations that might otherwise have failed through lack of adequate support and preparation. The man who had been dismissed as paranoid proved to be the architect of victory against enemies whose existence had been denied by those who should have been preparing to face them. The biological weapons facilities that were discovered and destroyed during the campaign against the Master represented a horrifying echo of the research that John's grandfather had encountered at Mariposa 40 years earlier, demonstrating that the impulses that had led to the development of the forced evolutionary virus had not died with the old world, but had been preserved and expanded by those who saw human beings as raw material for creating superior forms of life. The destruction of these laboratories ensured that the mistakes of the past would not be repeated, but the psychological impact of confronting such horrors was profound for everyone involved. The transformation of the forced evolutionary virus from a tool of human enhancement into a weapon of genocide reflected the same moral blindness that had characterized the pre-war research programs, showing how scientific advancement could be corrupted by the pursuit of power and the dehumanization of those who were seen as obstacles to progress. The super mutants who served as the Master's army were not monsters by choice, but victims of experiments that had robbed them of their humanity while transforming them into instruments of destruction. The final assault on the Master's stronghold required the Brotherhood to employ tactics and weapons that pushed their technological capabilities to their absolute limits, drawing on decades of accumulated knowledge and experience to overcome enemies whose enhanced physical capabilities and tactical coordination presented challenges unlike anything they had previously faced. The victory that was eventually achieved came at enormous cost in both material resources and human lives, but it demonstrated that the organization John had led through years of skepticism and internal conflict possessed the strength and determination necessary to protect civilization from its greatest threats. The aftermath of the victory over the Master's army saw John's reputation within the Brotherhood transformed from that of a paranoid leader whose warnings had been ignored to that of a visionary strategist whose foresight had enabled their survival against impossible odds. The elders who had questioned his judgment and competence were forced to acknowledge that his understanding of strategic threats had been superior to their own, that his supposedly irrational fears had been based on accurate assessment of dangers they had refused to recognize. But the vindication that John experienced in his final years could not undo the damage that decades of isolation and skepticism had inflicted on his psychological well-being and his relationship with the organization he had spent his life serving. The man who had saved the Brotherhood and possibly the entire wasteland from destruction remained a solitary figure whose personal sacrifices were understood by few and appreciated by fewer, his greatest triumph overshadowed by the loneliness that had marked his entire tenure as High Elder. The circumstances surrounding John's death remained shrouded in the same mystery that had characterized much of his later life, but the impact of his passing was felt throughout the Brotherhood and the wider wasteland community that had benefited from his leadership during the crisis that had threatened everyone's survival. The man who had been dismissed as mentally unstable had proven himself to be one of the most far-sighted and effective leaders in the organization's history, his legacy secured by victories that might never have been achieved without his strategic vision and determined leadership. The transformation of the Brotherhood under John's guidance from a regional organization focused primarily on preservation and defense into a major force capable of projecting power across continental distances reflected his understanding that survival in the post-war world required active engagement with threats rather than passive hope that isolation would provide adequate protection. The policies he had implemented and the relationships he had built created the foundation for future expansion and influence that would extend the Brotherhood's reach far beyond what previous generations had thought possible. The name of John Maxson became permanently associated with the Brotherhood's emergence as a significant force in post-war American politics and military affairs. His leadership during the crisis with the Master's Army, establishing precedents for cooperation with outside forces and intervention in conflicts that threatened the broader community of civilized settlements. The legacy he left to his successors was an organization that possessed both the military capabilities and the political relationships necessary to shape the future development of human civilization in the wasteland. The mystery surrounding John's final fate reflected the broader uncertainties that marked the transition from the Brotherhood's founding era to its period of continental expansion, as the organization grappled with questions about succession, mission priorities, and the proper balance between preservation of the past and active engagement with the challenges of an evolving world. The man who had guided them through their greatest victory had also left them facing their greatest questions about the future, his death marking the end of direct Maxson leadership, while opening possibilities for new forms of organizational development. The institutional memory of John's leadership would continue to influence Brotherhood policy and culture for generations, his example of strategic foresight and willingness to act on incomplete information, serving as guidance for future leaders who would face similar challenges in different contexts. The organization that survived the crisis with the Master's Army was stronger and more confident than ever before, but it was also more complex and politically sophisticated, shaped by experiences that had tested every aspect of its institutional character and emerging capabilities. The death of John Maxson marked the end of an era that had begun with his grandfather's rebellion at Mariposa and continued through 3 generations of leadership that had shaped the Brotherhood of Steel from a desperate band of military refugees into the most technologically advanced and organizationally sophisticated force in post-war America. But with his passing came a crisis of succession that would test every assumption the Brotherhood had made about leadership, legacy, and the proper relationship between inherited authority and earned competence in an organization that had grown far beyond what its founders could have envisioned. The Brotherhood that emerged from the victory over the Master's super mutant army was fundamentally different from the insular community that had developed during the organization's early decades at Lost Hills, transformed by experiences that had forced them to work with outsiders, coordinate complex military operations across vast distances, and confront threats that challenged their basic understanding of what was possible in the post-war world. The expansion of their mission from simple preservation to active engagement with continental-scale dangers had created new requirements for leadership that could not be met through traditional approaches to training and preparation. The absence of any clear heir to the Maxson legacy created opportunities for ambitious officers and political factions within the Brotherhood to advance their own visions of what the organization should become, leading to debates about fundamental questions of policy and priority that had remained settled during the decades when Maxson leadership provided unquestioned authority and institutional continuity. The political complexities that John Maxson had managed through personal relationships and inherited respect became sources of serious conflict when no single individual possessed the combination of competence and legitimacy necessary to impose unified direction on competing interests. Jeremy Maxson emerged from this period of uncertainty as a figure whose connection to the founding family remained unclear, but whose leadership capabilities were sufficient to earn recognition from the Elder Council and acceptance from Brotherhood members who valued institutional stability over genealogical purity. The man who claimed the right to carry the Maxson name into a new era of expansion possessed the vision and determination necessary to transform the Brotherhood's recent victory into the foundation for long-term growth and influence throughout the North American continent. The plans that Jeremy developed for eastward expansion reflected his understanding that the Brotherhood's future lay not in the California wasteland where they had achieved dominance, but in the unexplored regions where other survivor communities might benefit from their technological advantages and organizational expertise. The continental vision that had been implicit in the organization's mission since its founding would finally be realized through systematic exploration and settlement of territories that had remained largely unknown since the Great War devastated the Old World's communication and transportation networks. The expeditionary force that Jeremy assembled for the initial eastward expansion was composed of some of the Brotherhood's most capable and experienced personnel, men and women whose service during the campaign against the Master's army had proven their ability to operate effectively in hostile territory while maintaining the discipline and cohesion that successful military operations required. The 5 paladins who would lead the advance reconnaissance were selected not only for their combat skills, but for their ability to assess potential settlement sites and establish relationships with local communities that might serve as foundations for future Brotherhood presence. Paladin Brixley, who was chosen to command the expeditionary force, possessed the combination of tactical expertise and diplomatic skill that would be necessary for conducting operations in unknown territory where every encounter with other survivors could determine whether the Brotherhood's expansion would proceed through cooperation or conquest. His years of experience in negotiating with wasteland communities during trade missions and security operations had taught him to recognize the signs of trustworthy leadership and to distinguish between groups that could become valuable allies and those that would inevitably become dangerous enemies. The destination that Jeremy selected for the first major Brotherhood expansion eastward was not chosen randomly, but reflected careful analysis of pre-war intelligence that had been preserved in Lost Hills archives since the organization's founding. Peterson's bunker, located near Hoover Dam in the territory that had once been Nevada, represented exactly the kind of secure, well-equipped facility that could serve as a staging area for further exploration, while providing the technological resources and defensive capabilities necessary for maintaining Brotherhood presence in hostile territory. The story of Peterson's bunker was itself a testament to the foresight and preparation that had characterized some pre-war leaders who understood the approaching catastrophe and took steps to ensure their family's survival when the inevitable collapse finally occurred. Senator Todd Peterson had invested enormous resources in constructing a facility that would rival government installations in terms of security and sustainability, creating a refuge that could have supported his family through decades of post-war chaos if they had lived to use it for its intended purpose. But the irony of Peterson's bunker was that the man who had built it to protect his family from the coming war had been unable to save the one member of that family who had been far from home when the bombs fell. Corporal Ben Schilling, Todd Peterson's son who had taken his mother's name when he enlisted in the army, had survived the Great War only because his military service had placed him at Mariposa under Roger Maxson's command, making him one of the original Brotherhood founders who had walked the long road to Lost Hills 40 years earlier. The intelligence that Schilling had provided about his father's bunker during the Brotherhood's early years had been carefully preserved in organizational archives, along with detailed information about the facility's location, defenses, and internal layout that would prove invaluable to the expeditionary force charged with locating and securing the installation. The maps and access codes that the corporal had maintained, despite decades of separation from his family's legacy, would finally serve their intended purpose, though in service of goals that Senator Peterson could never have anticipated when he planned his elaborate survival preparations. The journey that Paladin Brixley's expeditionary force undertook across the wastelands separating California from Nevada represented the Brotherhood's first major venture beyond the territories they had come to dominate through decades of careful expansion and relationship building. The challenges they faced were not only geographical and logistical, but psychological, as soldiers who had grown accustomed to operating from secure bases with reliable supply lines found themselves completely dependent on their own resources and capabilities, while traversing hostile territory where every encounter could prove fatal. The discovery and successful occupation of Peterson's bunker validated Jeremy Maxson's vision of continental expansion, while providing the Brotherhood with their first permanent installation outside the California region that had been their exclusive domain since the organization's founding. The facility that they found exceeded even their most optimistic expectations, containing not only the defensive systems and life support equipment that had been anticipated, but technological resources and manufacturing capabilities that could support much more extensive operations than originally planned. The transformation of Peterson's bunker into a functioning Brotherhood chapter represented an achievement that established precedents for future expansion, while demonstrating the organization's ability to adapt its institutional structures and operational procedures to circumstances that differed significantly from those that had shaped their development in California. The new chapter that emerged from this successful colonization effort became proof that Brotherhood doctrine and discipline could be transplanted to distant territories without losing the essential characteristics that made the doctrine organization effective. The success of the Peterson's bunker expedition encouraged Jeremy Maxson to authorize additional eastward ventures that would eventually establish Brotherhood presence throughout the western regions of the North American continent, creating a network of interconnected installations that could support each other while extending the organization's influence and capabilities far beyond what previous generations of leaders had thought possible. The vision of a continental brotherhood that had remained theoretical during the organization's early decades finally began to take concrete form through systematic exploration and settlement. But the expansion eastward also created new challenges and complications that tested the Brotherhood's ability to maintain institutional unity and coherence across vast distances and diverse local conditions. The chapters that were established in distant territories faced situations and encountered problems that could not be anticipated by leaders who remained based in California, requiring degrees of autonomy and independent decision-making that sometimes conflicted with traditional Brotherhood emphasis on centralized authority and unified doctrine. The communication difficulties that inevitably arose between distant Brotherhood installations and the central leadership at Lost Hills created opportunities for local variation in policy and practice that gradually transformed the organization from a single unified entity into a loose confederation of related but semi-independent chapters. The technological limitations that made real-time coordination impossible across continental distances forced the development of new approaches to command and control that preserved essential Brotherhood characteristics while allowing for regional adaptation to local circumstances. The legacy of Jeremy Maxson's leadership during this crucial period of expansion was the establishment of the Brotherhood as a truly continental organization whose influence extended from the Pacific coast to the interior regions of North America, creating foundations for future growth that would eventually reach the Atlantic seaboard. His vision of systematic expansion and methodical establishment of permanent installations provided the strategic framework that would guide Brotherhood development for generations, even as the specific methods and priorities evolved to meet changing circumstances. Jonathan Maxson represented a different aspect of the family's continuing influence within the Brotherhood, serving not as a supreme leader, but as a high-ranking field commander whose dedication to the organization's mission was demonstrated through decades of service in some of the most dangerous and challenging assignments that post-war conditions could provide. His career as a paladin took him throughout the territories where Brotherhood influence was expanding, participating in operations that ranged from exploration and diplomacy to combat against threats that could not be resolved through negotiation or technological superiority. The service record that Jonathan compiled during his years as an active Brotherhood paladin reflected the organization's evolution from a primarily defensive force focused on preservation and protection to an active military power, capable of projecting force across vast distances in pursuit of objectives that served broader strategic goals. His participation in campaigns against mutant threats, raider organizations, and other dangers to civilized settlement demonstrated the Brotherhood's commitment to protecting communities that shared their basic values while expanding their own influence and capabilities. The relationship that Jonathan developed with Jessica, who would eventually become his wife and the mother of his child, represented one of the few instances in Brotherhood history where detailed records were maintained of a Maxson family member's personal life and domestic arrangements. The woman who became known as Lady Maxson was herself a significant figure within the organization, possessing education and capabilities that made her valuable as more than simply the wife of a prominent paladin. The marriage between Jonathan and Jessica produced a son who would carry the Maxson name into another generation, but the circumstances surrounding the child's early years were marked by the same dangers and uncertainties that had characterized the family's experience since Roger Maxson's first encounter with the moral complexities of military service in a world where traditional concepts of duty and loyalty had been rendered obsolete by the realities of post-war survival. The death of Jonathan Maxson during operations near the borders of New California Republic territory reflected the continuing risks faced by Brotherhood personnel who served in regions where political tensions and territorial disputes created conditions that could escalate into armed conflict without warning. The circumstances surrounding his death remained unclear, but the impact on his family was immediate and devastating, leaving Jessica to raise their young son while managing the practical and emotional challenges of widowhood in an organization where personal concerns were often subordinated to institutional needs. The internal conflicts that Jessica referenced in her decision to send her son eastward for his education and protection suggested that the Brotherhood's growth and expansion had created political tensions within the organization that threatened the safety of prominent families whose names and positions made them targets for factional disputes. The historical pattern of violence against Maxson family members, which had begun with the assassination of Maxson II by Viper cultists, appeared to be continuing, despite the organization's increased security and expanded capabilities. The decision to entrust her son's education and protection to Elder Owen Lyons reflected Jessica's understanding that the East Coast Brotherhood chapter offered opportunities for safety and development that could not be guaranteed in the more politically complex environment that had developed in California. The reputation that Lyons had earned for competence and integrity made him an obvious choice for someone seeking to ensure that the last known Maxson heir would receive the preparation necessary for eventually assuming his family's traditional role within the Brotherhood. The journey that carried the young Arthur Maxson across the North American continent from California to the East Coast represented not only a geographical transition, but a fundamental transformation in the circumstances and expectations that would shape his development from childhood through adulthood. The boy who had been born into the political complexities and factional disputes of the mature Brotherhood in California would be raised in the different environment of a frontier chapter where survival and mission accomplishment took precedence over the more subtle considerations of organizational politics. The death of Jessica Maxson that followed shortly after her son's departure for the East Coast eliminated the last direct connection between Arthur and the California chapters, where his family's legacy had been established and maintained for generations. The circumstances surrounding her death remained mysterious, but the timing suggested that the internal conflicts she had referenced were more serious and immediate than might have been apparent from her public statements and official communications. The orphaning of Arthur Maxson at such a young age created a situation that had no precedent in Brotherhood history, as the organization found itself responsible for raising and educating the heir to their founding family while he remained separated by thousands of miles and years of travel time from the chapters and leaders who best understood the traditions and expectations that his name carried. The burden of preparing him for eventual leadership fell entirely on the East Coast Brotherhood, whose own development had diverged significantly from the California model in ways that would influence every aspect of his formation. The mystery surrounding the persecution of the Maxson family during this period suggested that the Brotherhood's internal politics had become more complex and dangerous than the organization's public image would suggest, creating conditions where even the most prominent and historically significant members could become targets of violence and intimidation. The pattern of deaths and threats that had eliminated most of the family's adult members left Arthur as potentially the last bearer of a name that had shaped the Brotherhood's development since its founding. The isolation of Arthur from his family's ancestral strongholds and traditional allies meant that his understanding of Brotherhood history and his own legacy would be filtered through the perspectives and priorities of East Coast leaders who had developed their own interpretations of organizational doctrine and mission. The education he would receive and the relationships he would form would be shaped by circumstances that differed significantly from those that had influenced previous generations of Maxson leaders. The survival of the Maxson lineage through Arthur represented both an opportunity and a challenge for the Brotherhood as an institution, as the organization faced the question of whether a name that had provided legitimacy and continuity for generations could continue to serve those functions when divorced from the specific geographical and cultural contexts that had given it meaning. The boy who carried that name into an uncertain future would need to prove himself worthy of his inheritance while adapting to circumstances that his ancestors could never have anticipated. The transformation of the Maxson legacy from a California-based tradition to a continental phenomenon reflected the broader changes that had transformed the Brotherhood from a regional organization into a truly national force, but it also created questions about institutional identity and continuity that would need to be resolved as Arthur matured and began to assume the responsibilities that his name implied. The challenges he would face would test not only his personal capabilities, but the organization's ability to maintain its essential character while adapting to the realities of operating across vast distances and diverse local conditions. The stage was set for the emergence of a new kind of Maxson leader, one whose understanding of the Brotherhood's mission and methods would be shaped by frontier experiences rather than the more settled and institutionalized environment of the California chapters. The boy who would grow to manhood in the East Coast wasteland would carry forward his family's legacy while transforming it to meet the challenges of a world that continued to evolve in ways that demanded constant adaptation and innovation from those who would lead humanity's recovery from the devastation of nuclear war. The arrival of Arthur Maxson at the Citadel in the capital wasteland marked the beginning of a transformation that would reshape not only his own understanding of what it meant to bear the most famous name in Brotherhood history, but also the organization's conception of leadership, legacy, and the proper relationship between inherited authority and personal achievement in a world where survival depended more on individual competence than ancestral reputation. The 10-year-old boy who stepped from the transport that had carried him across the North American continent bore little resemblance to the confident young men who had assumed leadership of previous generations, his small frame and obvious youth making him seem almost fragile in comparison to the power-armored paladins who had gathered to witness his arrival. Elder Owen Lyons, who had accepted responsibility for the child's education and protection, found himself confronting challenges that no amount of military training or administrative experience had prepared him to handle. The man who had successfully led the East Coast Brotherhood through years of expansion and conflict now faced the delicate task of raising a boy whose name carried expectations that exceeded anything that could be taught through conventional instruction, whose future role in the organization was simultaneously inevitable and impossible to predict with any certainty. The citadel that became Arthur's new home was a fortress that embodied the Brotherhood's dual nature as both preservers of old-world knowledge and active participants in the ongoing struggle to rebuild civilization from the Balin ruins of nuclear devastation. The massive structure that had once served as a pre-war government facility now housed one of the most sophisticated collections of technology and information in post-war America, its laboratories and archives containing resources that represented decades of careful accumulation and preservation by Brotherhood scholars and scribes. But the Citadel was also unmistakably a military installation, its corridors echoing with the heavy footsteps of power-armored soldiers and the mechanical sounds of weapons being maintained and tested by armorers who understood that their work might determine the outcome of battles against enemies who possessed their own advanced capabilities. The atmosphere was one of constant preparation and vigilance, as the East Coast Brotherhood faced threats that were both more immediate and more varied than those encountered by their California counterparts. The education that Arthur received during his first years at the Citadel was comprehensive and rigorous, covering not only the basic academic subjects that any intelligent child would be expected to master, but the specialized knowledge of Brotherhood doctrine, history, and technology that would be necessary for anyone who might someday be called upon to provide leadership for the organization. His instructors were among the Brotherhood's finest scholars and most experienced officers, men and women who understood that they were preparing not just another recruit but the potential future of everything they served. The intellectual capabilities that Arthur displayed during these early educational experiences exceeded even the optimistic expectations that his instructors had developed based on his family's reputation for producing effective leaders. His capacity for memorizing complex information was remarkable, allowing him to absorb and retain details about Brotherhood procedures, technological specifications, and historical events that many adult members struggled to master completely. More importantly, he demonstrated the kind of analytical thinking that could synthesize information from multiple sources and apply it to novel situations that required creative problem-solving. The recitation of the Brotherhood Codex that Arthur accomplished during his 13th year represented a feat of memory and understanding that had been achieved by very few members throughout the organization's history, requiring not only the ability to reproduce lengthy passages of complex text, but genuine comprehension of the principles and reasoning that underlay the Brotherhood's fundamental beliefs about technology, duty, and the proper relationship between those who possessed advanced knowledge and those who did not. The ceremony that marked this achievement was attended by virtually every senior member of the East Coast chapter, acknowledging that they were witnessing something unprecedented in their experience. But the intellectual precocity that made Arthur exceptional in academic settings could not compensate for the profound isolation that characterized his daily life within the Citadel's walls. The absence of other children meant that his social development occurred entirely in the company of adults, whose relationships with him were inevitably complicated by awareness of his family name and the expectations that accompanied it. The normal experiences of childhood friendship, rivalry, and cooperation were replaced by more formal interactions that left crucial aspects of his emotional development unaddressed. The loneliness that Arthur experienced during his early years at the Citadel was exacerbated by the knowledge that his presence represented both an honor and a burden for the Brotherhood members who were responsible for his care, education. He understood, with the perceptiveness that intelligent children often display, that every adult who interacted with him was simultaneously seeing the boy he was and imagining the leader he might become, creating a psychological pressure that made genuine personal relationships almost impossible to establish or maintain. The friendship that Arthur attempted to develop with Liberty Prime, the massive pre-war military robot that served as one of the Brotherhood's most important technological assets, reflected both his desperate need for companionship and his intuitive understanding that machines might offer the kind of uncomplicated relationship that was impossible to find with human beings, whose interactions with him were inevitably influenced by political considerations and institutional expectations. The giant robot's responses to his presence, while programmed rather than genuinely emotional, provided a form of consistent and predictable interaction that was absent from his dealings with adult Brotherhood members. Scribe Rothschild's decision to ban Arthur from the laboratory where Liberty Prime was housed represented more than simple adherence to safety protocols, reflecting the older man's understanding that the boy's attachment to the robot was becoming psychologically unhealthy and potentially dangerous to his future development as a leader who would need to form effective relationships with human beings, rather than depending on machines for emotional support. The lesson that Rothschild intended to teach about the fundamental differences between artificial and human consciousness would prove to be one of the most influential aspects of Arthur's education, shaping his adult attitudes toward technology and its proper role in human society. The harshness of Rothschild's intervention, while necessary from an institutional perspective, deepened Arthur's sense of isolation and reinforced his growing understanding that his position within the Brotherhood was fundamentally different from that of any other member. The man who had denied him his only source of uncomplicated companionship had done so not from cruelty but from concern for his proper development, but the distinction was lost on a child who simply knew that another source of comfort had been removed from his increasingly circumscribed world. Sarah Lyons emerged as the closest approximation to a genuine relationship that Arthur would experience during his years of preparation for leadership. Her role as the elder's daughter, creating sufficient status within the Brotherhood hierarchy to allow her to interact with him without the excessive deference or calculated positioning that characterized his dealings with most other members. The young woman, who was already establishing herself as one of the organization's most promising warriors, possessed the combination of martial skill and emotional intelligence that made her uniquely suited to serve as both mentor, surrogate older sister to a boy who desperately needed both. The combat training that Sarah provided went far beyond the standard instruction that all Brotherhood members received, incorporating techniques and tactical concepts that had been developed through her extensive experience in the capital wasteland's unique operational environment. Her teaching methods combined physical conditioning with psychological preparation, ensuring that Arthur would possess not only the technical skills necessary for effective fighting, but the mental toughness required to make life and death decisions under the extreme stress that characterized combat against the prolific, varied threats that the East Coast Brotherhood faced regularly. But perhaps more importantly, Sarah's instruction included lessons about leadership that could not be found in any manual or codex, insights about human nature and organizational dynamics that had been learned through years of commanding soldiers in situations where failure meant not just mission failure, but death for everyone under her authority. The concepts she taught about inspiring loyalty, maintaining discipline, and making difficult decisions that balanced competing priorities would prove essential to Arthur's eventual success as a leader, providing practical knowledge that supplemented the theoretical education he received from other instructors. The relationship that developed between Arthur and Sarah was complicated by the knowledge that both participants carried about their respective destinies within the Brotherhood hierarchy. As the boy who would someday lead the organization formed his closest personal bond with the woman, who might have been expected to assume that role herself, if not for the accident of her birth, into a family that lacked the historical significance of the Maxson name. The potential for future conflict between personal loyalty and institutional obligation created undercurrents of complexity that both understood, but neither could directly address. The expectations that surrounded Arthur's development created psychological pressure that would have been difficult for any child to bear. But the additional burden of growing up in an environment where his every action and statement was evaluated for evidence of future leadership potential made normal childhood development almost impossible. The adults who supervised his education and training were constantly looking for signs that he was living up to his family's reputation, creating a form of scrutiny that forced him to become conscious of his own behavior in ways that children should not be required to experience. The mythology that had developed around the Maxson name during the decades since the Brotherhood's founding meant that Arthur was expected to demonstrate not only competence but exceptional ability in every area of development, as if genetic inheritance could guarantee the kind of extraordinary capabilities that had characterized his ancestors. The belief that his soul was forged from eternal steel, while intended as encouragement and inspiration, created pressure to live up to standards that were both unrealistic and psychologically damaging for a child who was still developing his basic sense of identity and self-worth. Arthur's private doubts about his ability to meet these expectations were carefully concealed from the adults around him, but they influenced every aspect of his development and created internal conflicts that would persist throughout his life. The boy who was praised for achievements that would be considered remarkable in any other child understood that his successes were measured against the accomplishments of men who had lived through the end of the world and emerged as founders of a new order, making even his most impressive achievements seem inadequate by comparison. The isolation that characterized Arthur's childhood was not simply social but existential, as he struggled to develop a sense of personal identity that was separate from the legendary reputation of his family name. The question of who he might have become, if freed from the burden of inherited expectations, was one that could never be answered, but its influence on his psychological development was profound and lasting. creating patterns of thought and behavior that would shape his approach to leadership and personal relationships throughout his adult life. The death of Elder Owen Lyons when Arthur was approaching his teenage years represented the loss of the closest thing to a father figure that he had known since arriving at the Citadel, removing from his life the one adult who had combined genuine affection with the authority necessary to provide guidance and protection. The old man who had accepted responsibility for raising the last Maxson had fulfilled his obligation with dedication and wisdom, but his passing left Arthur more isolated than ever within an organization that revered his name, while remaining uncertain about his readiness for the responsibilities it implied. The death of Sarah Lyons that followed shortly after her father's passing was an even more devastating blow to Arthur's psychological well-being, eliminating the one person with whom he had developed something approaching a normal human relationship. The woman who had served as mentor, sister, and friend had been killed in combat against the same kinds of enemies that had claimed so many Brotherhood lives throughout the organization's history, but her loss was particularly cruel because it removed from Arthur's life the only person who had treated him as an individual rather than as a symbol or institution. The period of leadership chaos that followed the deaths of both Leon created an opportunity for Arthur to observe firsthand the political dynamics and organizational challenges that leaders faced when attempting to guide the Brotherhood through periods of uncertainty and change. The young man who had been educated in theory about command and administration now witnessed the practical difficulties of maintaining institutional coherence when competing personalities and philosophies struggled for control of an organization whose mission and methods were subject to ongoing debate and revision. The rapid development of Arthur's own capabilities during this crisis period reflected not only his natural talents and excellent education, but his understanding that the Brotherhood's survival might depend on his willingness to assume responsibilities for which his age and experience had not fully prepared him. The teenager who had been content to remain a student and observer found himself forced to become an active participant in the organization's governance, demonstrating leadership qualities that surprised even those who had been most optimistic about his potential. The decision to pursue active military service rather than remaining in the protective environment that had characterized his childhood represented Arthur's recognition that theoretical knowledge and inherited authority were insufficient foundations for the kind of leadership that the Brotherhood required. The young man who bore the most famous name in the organization's history understood that he would need to prove himself through personal achievement and demonstrated competence before anyone would willingly follow him into the dangers that leadership inevitably entailed. The training exercises and patrol duties that Arthur undertook during his early military service were designed not only to develop his tactical skills, but to provide him with the practical experience of working with ordinary Brotherhood soldiers whose loyalty would need to be earned through demonstrated competence rather than demanded on the basis of family name. The interactions he had with enlisted personnel and junior officers provided insights into the organization's culture and concerns that had been invisible to him during his years of privileged education and protected development. The expectations that other Brotherhood members had developed about Arthur's capabilities were simultaneously inspiring and intimidating, as he found himself surrounded by people who believed that his genetic inheritance would eventually manifest as extraordinary leadership ability, while privately wondering whether such expectations could possibly be fulfilled. The weight of living up to a reputation that had been established by men whose achievements belonged to legend rather than personal memory created psychological challenges that supplemented the physical and intellectual demands of military training. The combat skills that Arthur developed during his teenage years reflected not only excellent instruction and natural aptitude, but a determination to master every aspect of military science that might be relevant to his future responsibilities as a leader. His proficiency with various weapons systems, his understanding of tactical doctrine, and his ability to coordinate complex operations exceeded what would normally be expected of someone his age. But these achievements were measured against standards that had been established by the extraordinary circumstances of post-war survival and Brotherhood institutional culture. The psychological transformation that Arthur underwent during his transition from protected child to active warrior was profound and irreversible, as the boy who had known safety and privilege within the Citadel's walls learned to function effectively in the dangerous environment of the capital wasteland, where every patrol could encounter enemies capable of killing even experienced Brotherhood soldiers. The education he received through direct exposure to combat and its aftermath provided lessons about leadership, mortality, and human nature that could not be taught through any amount of classroom instruction. The leadership qualities that began to emerge during Arthur's military service were noticed and evaluated by senior Brotherhood officers who understood that they were observing the development of someone who might eventually assume supreme command of the organization. His ability to remain calm under pressure, make effective decisions with limited information, and inspire confidence in subordinates demonstrated that the theoretical education he had received was being successfully translated into practical capabilities that would serve him well in positions of increasing responsibility. The internal conflicts that Arthur experienced during this period of rapid personal growth reflected the broader tensions within the East Coast Brotherhood as the organization struggled to define its mission and methods in response to changing circumstances and evolving threats. The young man who was being prepared for leadership found himself witnessing debates about fundamental questions of policy and priority that would influence the Brotherhood's development for generations, providing him with insights into the complexities of organizational governance that would prove essential to his eventual success. The reputation that Arthur began to establish through his military service was based not on inherited status but on demonstrated achievement, creating a foundation of respect and loyalty that would be essential to his future effectiveness as a leader. The soldiers who served alongside him during training exercises and combat operations learned to evaluate him based on his actual capabilities rather than the mythology that surrounded his family name, providing him with the kind of genuine relationships that had been largely absent from his childhood experiences. The challenges that Arthur faced during his final years of preparation for leadership were complicated by his growing awareness that the Brotherhood's future might depend on his ability to synthesize the competing visions and conflicting priorities that had emerged within the organization following the deaths of the Lyons family. The young man who had been raised to continue a family tradition of leadership found himself in a position where that tradition would need to be adapted or perhaps fundamentally transformed to meet the challenges of a changing world. The stage was set for Arthur's emergence as a leader whose approach to command would combine the traditional Brotherhood values that had been instilled through his education with innovations and adaptations that reflected his unique experience of growing up in the post-war world's most dangerous frontier. The boy who had arrived at the Citadel as an orphaned child, carrying nothing but his family's legendary name, had been transformed through years of intensive preparation into a young man capable of assuming responsibilities that would test every aspect of his character and capabilities while determining the future course of one of the wasteland's most important institutions. The transformation of Arthur Maxson from a privileged child sheltered within the Citadel's protective walls to a warrior capable of surviving and thriving in the capital wasteland's most dangerous territories began with a training patrol that should have been routine. The the kind of supervised exercise designed to provide young Brotherhood members with controlled exposure to the realities of combat without exposing them to genuine mortal danger. The 12-year-old boy who set out that morning with a full escort of experienced soldiers carried with him not only the standard equipment that all Brotherhood personnel were issued, but the accumulated expectations of an entire organization that had been watching his development with intense interest and growing anticipation. The escort that accompanied Arthur on what was intended to be his first real exposure to combat conditions consisted of some of the East Coast Brotherhood's most seasoned veterans, paladins and knights whose service records included successful operations against every type of enemy that the capital wasteland could produce. These were not merely babysitters assigned to protect a child, but elite soldiers whose presence was intended to ensure that Arthur's introduction to warfare would be educational rather than fatal, providing him with opportunities to observe and learn without exposing him to risks that his age and inexperience made him unable to handle effectively. The raiders who attacked the patrol had chosen their ambush site with the tactical sophistication that marked them as experienced predators rather than desperate scavengers, positioning themselves along a route that the Brotherhood used regularly for training exercises and supply runs. Their knowledge of Brotherhood patrol patterns and their possession of weapons that were more advanced than the crude firearms typically employed by wasteland bandits suggested that they represented a more serious threat than the routine opposition that training missions were designed to encounter. The initial moments of the ambush were marked by the kind of chaos and confusion that characterized most combat encounters, as carefully planned tactical formations dissolved into individual struggles for survival, while soldiers who had been walking in relaxed patrol order found themselves fighting for their lives against enemies who possessed both numerical superiority and the advantages that came with choosing the time and place of engagement. The air filled with the distinctive sounds of energy, weapons fire, and the screams of wounded men, creating a sensory assault that would have overwhelmed most children and left them paralyzed with terror. But Arthur's response to the sudden eruption of violence around him was not the panic that might have been expected from someone his age, but a cold assessment of the tactical situation and an immediate decision to take action that would contribute to his companion's survival, rather than simply seeking cover and waiting for the engagement to end. The training that had been drilled into him through years of theoretical instruction and practice exercises had prepared him not only with technical knowledge about weapons and tactics, but with the psychological conditioning necessary to function effectively when death was an immediate possibility for everyone involved. The two raiders who died at Arthur's hands during those first crucial minutes of combat were eliminated not through luck or accident, but through the application of skills that exceeded what anyone had expected a 12-year-old to possess, even one who had received the finest training that the Brotherhood could provide. The precision with which he employed his laser rifle demonstrated not only technical proficiency, but the kind of tactical awareness that allowed him to identify targets, assess threat priorities, and engage enemies in the proper sequence to maximize the effectiveness of his contribution to the overall engagement. The veterans who witnessed Arthur's performance during the ambush were forced to revise their assumptions about his readiness for combat operations, recognizing that the boy they had been assigned to protect possessed capabilities that made him an asset rather than a liability in dangerous situations. The calm efficiency with which he had eliminated two experienced raiders while under fire marked him as someone who could be trusted to function effectively in combat, rather than requiring constant supervision and protection from more experienced soldiers. The aftermath of the engagement provided Arthur with his first direct experience of the psychological impact that came with taking human life, as the adrenaline rush of combat gave way to the more complex emotions that accompanied the knowledge that his actions had ended the existence of other conscious beings. The raiders he had killed were undoubtedly dangerous predators who would have murdered him and his companions without hesitation. But they had also been human beings with their own histories and motivations, creating moral complexities that no amount of training could fully prepare someone to process. The counseling that Arthur received from Brotherhood chaplains and psychologists following his first combat experience was designed to help him develop healthy approaches to dealing with the inevitable psychological consequences of warfare, while preventing the kind of emotional damage that could interfere with his future effectiveness as a leader. The techniques he learned for processing trauma and maintaining psychological equilibrium would prove essential throughout his career, as the responsibilities of leadership would expose him to forms of stress and moral complexity that exceeded even the normal burdens of military service. The reputation that began to develop around Arthur following his performance during the ambush represented the beginning of his transformation from a child, defined primarily by his family name, into a young warrior whose personal achievements provided independent justification for the respect and loyalty of his Brotherhood colleagues. The soldiers who had witnessed his actions under fire began to speak of him not as the last Maxson, but as a genuinely capable combatant whose presence enhanced rather than endangered any unit to which he might be assigned. The year that followed Arthur's first combat experience was marked by increasingly challenging training exercises and patrol assignments, as Brotherhood leadership sought to develop his capabilities while providing him with the breadth of experience that would be necessary for eventual assumption of supreme command. The missions he undertook ranged from routine reconnaissance and supply escort duties to more dangerous operations against mutant infestations and raider strongholds that required the full application of Brotherhood technological advantages and tactical doctrine. But the most significant challenge that Arthur would face during his 13th year came not from human enemies, but from one of the wasteland's most dangerous predators, the Deathclaw, whose combination of physical strength, speed, and cunning had made it the apex predator throughout much of post-war America. The encounter that would define Arthur's reputation within the Brotherhood and establish his credentials as a warrior worthy of his family name occurred during what should have been a routine patrol through territory that was considered secure from major threats. The Deathclaw that Arthur encountered had established its territory in ruins that provided excellent concealment and multiple escape routes, creating a hunting ground where its natural advantages were maximized, and its prey would be unable to employ the superior firepower that normally gave human survivors significant advantages over even the most dangerous mutant predators. The creature's intelligence and patience had enabled it to avoid detection by previous Brotherhood patrols while hunting settlers and traders who were unfortunate enough to venture into its domain. The separation from his patrol unit that left Arthur alone with the Deathclaw was not the result of carelessness or poor tactical planning, but the creature's deliberate strategy of isolating individual targets from their companions, using its intimate knowledge of local terrain to create situations where numerical and technological advantages could be neutralized through superior positioning and timing. The young warrior who found himself facing the most dangerous predator in the wasteland understood immediately that his survival would depend entirely on his own capabilities and the training that had been instilled through years of intensive preparation. The combat that followed was not the brief, decisive engagement that characterized most encounters with firearms, but a prolonged struggle that tested every aspect of Arthur's physical conditioning, tactical knowledge, and psychological resilience. The Deathclaw's natural armor provided protection against conventional weapons that forced him to seek vulnerable spots while avoiding claws and teeth that could end the fight with a single successful strike, creating a deadly dance that required perfect timing and absolute precision. The laser rifle that Arthur carried provided him with his primary advantage over the Deathclaw, but the weapon's effectiveness depended on his ability to maintain distance while delivering sustained fire to vulnerable areas that were difficult to target while under the stress of mortal combat. The creature's speed and agility made accurate shooting extremely challenging, while its intelligence enabled it to learn from his tactics and adapt its approach in ways that forced him to constantly revise his strategy. The wounds that Arthur sustained during the encounter were severe enough to require immediate medical attention, but they were also evidence of his willingness to accept personal injury in order to achieve tactical objectives that would ultimately determine the outcome of the engagement. The scars that would mark his face for the rest of his life were not merely disfiguring injuries, but badges of honor that would serve as permanent reminders of his courage and capability to anyone who questioned his worthiness to lead. The killing blow that finally ended the Deathclaw's life was delivered at close range, with a weapon that had been damaged during the fight, requiring Arthur to expose himself to the creature's final desperate attack while maintaining the accuracy necessary to penetrate its heavily armored skull with a shot that had to be perfect on the first attempt. The moment when the massive predator finally collapsed represented not only Arthur's survival, but his transformation into a legend that would be remembered and retold throughout Brotherhood ranks for generations. The recovery period that followed Arthur's solitary victory over the Deathclaw provided him with time to process the psychological impact of an experience that had tested him beyond anything he had previously encountered, while the visible scars he now carried served as constant reminders of his own mortality and the prices that leadership in the post-war world could demand from those who accepted its responsibilities. The facial disfigurement that might have been considered a tragedy in the old world became in the wasteland a mark of distinction that commanded respect and admiration from warriors who understood the courage required to face such dangers. The transformation in how other Brotherhood members regarded Arthur following his victory over the Deathclaw was immediate and profound, as the boy who had previously been seen primarily as the heir to a legendary name was now recognized as a warrior whose personal achievements provided independent justification for the respect and loyalty that his position demanded. The soldiers who had once deferred to him out of institutional obligation now offered the genuine regard that could only be earned through demonstrated competence under the most challenging conditions. But the most significant impact of Arthur's victory was not the external recognition it brought, but the internal confidence it provided, as the young warrior who had previously struggled with doubts about his ability to live up to his family's reputation now possessed unshakable knowledge that he could face the wasteland's greatest dangers and emerge victorious through his own capabilities rather than inherited advantages. The self-assurance that came from this experience would influence every aspect of his future development and leadership style. The missions that Arthur undertook during the months following his encounter with the Deathclaw were characterized by increasing complexity and responsibility, as Brotherhood leadership sought to provide him with the full range of experiences that would be necessary for eventual assumption of supreme command. His assignments included not only combat operations, but diplomatic missions, administrative duties, and strategic planning exercises that tested his ability to think beyond immediate tactical concerns to the broader questions of policy and priority that would define his eventual leadership approach. The super-mutant threat that had plagued the capital wasteland for decades represented exactly the kind of challenge that required not only military capability, but strategic thinking and organizational coordination that went beyond simple combat operations. The creatures that had emerged from the region's pre-war laboratories possessed not only enhanced physical capabilities, but crude intelligence that enabled them to organize coordinated attacks and establish fortified positions that required sophisticated tactics to eliminate effectively. The campaign against the super mutants that Arthur helped to plan and execute during his 15th year represented the Brotherhood's most ambitious military operation since their arrival in the capital wasteland, requiring the coordination of multiple combat units and the employment of the organization's most advanced weapons and equipment. The strategic planning that preceded the operation involved detailed intelligence gathering, logistical preparation, and tactical coordination that tested every aspect of the East Coast Brotherhood's institutional capabilities. Shepard, the super mutant leader who had organized his kind into a coherent military force capable of threatening established settlements throughout the region, represented a level of threat that exceeded anything the Brotherhood had previously encountered in their efforts to secure the wasteland for human habitation. The creature's intelligence and tactical acumen had enabled it to transform scattered bands of mutants into something approaching a conventional army that possessed both the numbers and organization necessary to challenge even the Brotherhood's technological advantages. The elimination of Shepard became not only a tactical objective but a symbolic necessity, as the super mutants' continued existence represented a direct challenge to Brotherhood authority and effectiveness in the region they had claimed as their responsibility. The operation that was designed to locate and eliminate the creature required extensive reconnaissance, careful planning, and precise execution that would demonstrate the organization's capability to deal with threats that exceeded normal parameters. Arthur's role in the successful elimination of Shepard was not that of a mere participant, but a key planner and combat leader whose contribution was essential to the operation's success, demonstrating that his tactical abilities had developed to the point where he could function effectively at the highest levels of Brotherhood operations. The kill that he achieved was not simply another victory in combat, but proof that he possessed the strategic thinking and operational capability necessary for dealing with the most serious threats that the organization faced. The psychological impact of Shepard's death on the super mutant population throughout the capital wasteland was immediate and decisive, as the creatures who had been organized into a coherent force under his leadership reverted to the scattered bands of dangerous but uncoordinated predators that they had been before his emergence as a unifying figure. The elimination of central leadership had effectively ended the organized threat that the mutants had posed to human settlement and Brotherhood operations throughout the region. The recognition that Arthur received from the West Coast Brotherhood following the successful elimination of Shepard represented validation not only of his personal achievements, but of the East Coast chapter's effectiveness and the quality of leadership development that had been provided during his formative years. The communication from the organization's original leadership, acknowledging his readiness for promotion to provisional elder, represented the culmination of years of careful observation and evaluation by the Brotherhood's most senior leaders. The promotion to provisional elder that Arthur received at the age of 16 made him the youngest person in Brotherhood history to achieve such rank, but the title came with responsibilities and expectations that would test every aspect of his preparation and development. The position required him to make decisions that could affect the lives and welfare of hundreds of Brotherhood members while representing the organization in negotiations with outside groups whose cooperation was essential to the chapter's continued effectiveness. The reunion of the East Coast Brotherhood with the Brotherhood outcasts that Arthur engineered during his first year as provisional elder represented one of the most significant diplomatic achievements in the organization's history, ending a schism that had weakened both groups and created unnecessary conflicts that had hindered the Brotherhood's effectiveness in the region. The negotiations that brought the two factions together required not only tactical concessions, but fundamental compromises about policy and priority that tested Arthur's ability to balance competing interests while maintaining institutional unity. The success of the reunification effort demonstrated that Arthur possessed not only the military capabilities that had been proven through his combat achievements, but the political skills and strategic vision that would be necessary for leading the Brotherhood through the complex challenges that lay ahead. The ability to bring together groups that had been divided by fundamental disagreements about mission and methods showed that he could function as a unifying figure rather than simply another factional leader. The confirmation of Arthur's promotion to full elder status at the age of 16 represented the Brotherhood's acknowledgement that he had successfully completed the transition from promising youth to capable leader, but it also marked the beginning of new phases of development and responsibility that would test his abilities in ways that no amount of preparation could fully anticipate. The youngest elder in Brotherhood history now faced the challenge of justifying the organization's confidence while leading them through an uncertain future that would require all the wisdom and capability he could provide. The stage was set for Arthur's emergence as a leader whose approach to command would combine traditional Brotherhood values with innovations and adaptations that reflected his unique experience of growing up in the post-war world's most dangerous frontier, his proven abilities in combat and diplomacy, providing the foundation for achievements that would eclipse even the legendary accomplishments of his ancestors who had founded and shaped the organization through its early development. The construction of the Pridwen began not with grand ceremonies or public announcements, but with quiet discussions in the deepest chambers of the Citadel, where Brotherhood engineers and senior scribes gathered around technical drawings that represented the most ambitious project undertaken by the organization since their arrival in the capital wasteland decades earlier. The airship that existed only as blueprints and calculations during those early planning sessions would eventually become the symbol of Arthur Maxson's transformation from regional elder to continental commander, but its origins lay in the practical recognition that the Brotherhood's future expansion would require capabilities that ground-based operations could not provide. The inspiration for the Pridwen came from historical records that documented the Brotherhood's earlier use of airborne platforms during their expansion across the California wasteland, when the organization's smaller size and different tactical requirements had made aerial mobility both feasible and advantageous. But the vessel that Arthur's engineers envisioned would exceed those earlier aircraft in every measure of capability and sophistication, incorporating technological advances that had been developed during decades of research and salvage operations throughout the capital wasteland. The 2 years of design work that preceded actual construction were marked by countless revisions and refinements as Brotherhood technical specialists struggled to balance the competing requirements of payload capacity, defensive capability, operational range, and structural integrity that would determine whether their ambitious project would succeed as a mobile command center or fail as an expensive monument to overreach. The challenges they faced were not merely technical but logistical, requiring the identification and acquisition of materials and components that were rare or entirely unavailable through normal supply channels. The advanced enclave technology that formed the foundation of the Pridwen's most sophisticated systems had been recovered from Adams Air Force Base during the Brotherhood's campaign against that organization's remnants, providing access to pre-war military equipment whose capabilities far exceeded anything that post-war manufacturers had been able to reproduce. The power systems, communication arrays, and defensive installations that were salvaged from enclave facilities represented decades of technological development that would have been impossible for the Brotherhood to duplicate independently. The fusion plant that would provide the Pridwen with virtually unlimited operational endurance was extracted from an aircraft carrier whose massive hull had been serving as the foundation for a settlement that called itself Rivet City. though the Brotherhood's official records maintain diplomatic silence about the specific source of this crucial component. The delicate negotiations that were required to obtain such a vital piece of equipment tested Arthur's diplomatic skills while demonstrating the growing influence that the Brotherhood could project when their interests required cooperation from other wasteland communities. The workshops and laboratories that were established within the citadel for the Prydwen's construction transformed the fortress into something resembling a pre-war industrial complex, as scribes and engineers worked around the clock to fabricate components that met specifications demanding precision that pushed post-war manufacturing capabilities to their absolute limits. The sounds of metal being shaped and welded echoed through corridors that had previously known only the measured rhythms of military routine, creating an atmosphere of purposeful activity that infected the entire Brotherhood community with enthusiasm for their unprecedented undertaking. The launch of the Prydwen in 2082 represented not merely a technological achievement, but a psychological transformation for the East Coast Brotherhood, as the organization that had been primarily focused on regional concerns found itself possessed of capabilities that could project power across continental distances. The massive airship that rose into the sky above the capital wasteland carried with it the hopes and ambitions of every Brotherhood member who had contributed to its creation, but it also carried responsibilities that would test Arthur's leadership in ways that no previous Maxson had experienced. The integration of the Prydwen into Brotherhood operational doctrine required fundamental changes in how the organization approached strategic planning and tactical operations, as capabilities that had been purely theoretical suddenly became available for addressing challenges that had previously seemed beyond their reach. The mobile command center that the airship provided enabled coordination of activities across vast geographical areas, while offering the kind of rapid deployment and extraction capabilities that transformed the Brotherhood from a defensive force into an interventionist power. The vertibird fleet that operated from the Prydwen's flight deck provided the Brotherhood with close air support and rapid transportation capabilities that had been previously available only to the most technologically advanced pre-war military organizations, enabling them to respond to emerging situations with speed and effectiveness that gave them decisive advantages over enemies who remained dependent on ground-based movement. The psychological impact of these aerial assets extended far beyond their immediate tactical value, creating an aura of technological superiority that influenced the behavior of both enemies and potential allies throughout the regions where Brotherhood operations were conducted. The clinic and medical facilities that were incorporated into the Prydwen's design reflected Arthur's understanding that the Brotherhood's expansion into distant territories would require self-sufficiency in all aspects of operation, including the ability to treat injuries and illnesses that could not wait for evacuation to established medical facilities. The surgical suites and research laboratories that were built into the airship's structure provided capabilities that exceeded what was available in most wasteland settlements, creating opportunities for the Brotherhood to offer medical assistance as a diplomatic tool while ensuring the health and effectiveness of their own personnel. The armory that occupied a significant portion of the Prydwen's internal space contained not only the personal weapons and equipment that would be carried by Brotherhood personnel during ground operations, but also the heavy weapons, systems and specialized equipment that might be required for dealing with threats that exceeded normal tactical parameters. The inventory of laser rifles, plasma weapons, power armor suits, and explosives that were stored within the airship's secured compartments represented the accumulated military might of the entire East Coast Brotherhood, concentrated in a single mobile platform that could deploy this force wherever Arthur's strategic vision demanded. The barracks and living quarters that provided accommodation for the Prydwen's crew and passengers were designed with an understanding that the airship might serve as home for hundreds of Brotherhood members for extended periods, requiring amenities and facilities that would maintain morale and effectiveness during long deployments far from established bases. The recreation areas, dining facilities, and personal quarters that were built into the vessel's structure reflected lessons learned from decades of military operations about the importance of psychological as well as physical support for personnel operating under stressful conditions. The research facilities that were established within the Prydwen enabled the Brotherhood to continue their fundamental mission of technological preservation and advancement, even while engaged in active military operations, providing laboratories and workshops where scribes could analyze recovered artifacts and develop new applications for existing knowledge. The combination of mobility and research capability that the airship provided meant that the Brotherhood could respond to technological discoveries anywhere within their operational range, without sacrificing their ability to study and understand the materials they recovered. The workshops that supported the Prydwen's maintenance and operational requirements represented some of the most advanced manufacturing capabilities available in the post-war world, enabling the Brotherhood to fabricate replacement parts and specialized equipment without depending on external suppliers whose reliability and loyalty could not be guaranteed. The self-sufficiency that these facilities provided was essential to the airship's role as an independent operational platform that might be required to function for months without access to established supply chains. The command and control systems that enabled Arthur to coordinate Brotherhood activities across vast distances from the Prydwen's bridge were among the most sophisticated installations that post-war technology could provide, incorporating communication arrays, sensor networks, and data processing capabilities that gave him unprecedented situational awareness and operational flexibility. The ability to receive real-time intelligence from multiple sources while maintaining secure communications with distant Brotherhood chapters transformed the nature of strategic planning and tactical coordination in ways that would influence military doctrine for generations. The reputation that the Prydwen developed throughout the wasteland during its early operational period reflected not only its impressive technological capabilities, but the psychological impact that such a massive and obviously advanced aircraft had on communities that had grown accustomed to the technological limitations that characterized most post-war organizations. The sight of the Brotherhood's mobile fortress passing overhead became a symbol of their growing power and influence, creating both opportunities for cooperation and sources of concern among groups whose interests might conflict with Brotherhood objectives. The detection of unusual energy signatures in the Commonwealth that prompted Arthur's decision to authorize a major expeditionary force represented exactly the kind of strategic intelligence that the Prydwen's advanced sensor systems had been designed to gather and analyze. The patterns of electromagnetic activity that were detected from hundreds of miles away suggested technological developments that could pose threats or offer opportunities that warranted direct investigation by the Brotherhood's most capable forces. The decision to deploy the Prydwen and a substantial portion of the East Coast Brotherhood's military assets to investigate Commonwealth conditions was not made lightly, but reflected Arthur's understanding that the organization's future growth and security might depend on their ability to identify and address emerging challenges before they could develop into existential threats. The intelligence that had been gathered through long-range reconnaissance suggested that the Commonwealth contained both dangerous technologies that needed to be secured or destroyed, and potential resources that could support further Brotherhood expansion. The preparation for the Commonwealth expedition required months of logistical planning and resource allocation, as Arthur and his staff worked to ensure that the deployment would be self-sufficient for an extended period, while maintaining adequate defenses for Brotherhood installations that would remain in the capital wasteland. The balance between offensive capability and defensive security that had to be achieved tested every aspect of the organization's strategic planning and resource management capabilities. The departure of the Pridwen from the capital wasteland marked a turning point in Brotherhood history comparable to the original exodus from Mariposa or the first expansion beyond California, representing Arthur's transformation of the organization from a primarily defensive force focused on regional concerns into an active interventionist power, capable of projecting force anywhere on the continent where their interests or responsibilities required their presence. The journey to the Commonwealth provided Arthur with opportunities to observe firsthand the conditions that existed throughout the territories between the capital wasteland and their intended destination, gathering intelligence about political developments, technological capabilities, and potential threats or opportunities that might influence future Brotherhood operations. The aerial perspective that the Pridwen provided enabled comprehensive reconnaissance that would have been impossible through ground-based operations, creating detailed maps and assessments that enhanced the Brotherhood's understanding of continental conditions. The arrival of the Pridwen over Boston represented a dramatic demonstration of Brotherhood power that immediately transformed the political and military balance throughout the Commonwealth, as every faction and settlement in the region was forced to reassess their strategies and objectives in light of the massive technological superiority that the airship's presence represented. The psychological impact of the Brotherhood's arrival was as significant as their actual military capabilities, creating opportunities for diplomacy and intimidation that could be employed to achieve objectives without requiring direct combat. The initial assessment of Commonwealth conditions that Arthur conducted from the Pridwen's command center revealed a complex political situation that offered both challenges and opportunities for Brotherhood expansion, as multiple factions with competing agendas struggled for control of territories that contained valuable resources and strategic positions. The Institute's advanced technology and secretive operations presented particular concerns, while the railroad's activities and the various raider groups created additional complications that would require careful management. The establishment of Brotherhood operations throughout the Commonwealth required the construction of new facilities and the adaptation of existing installations to support the organization's expanded presence in the region, creating logistical challenges that tested the limits of their supply and transportation capabilities. The forward operating bases that were established to support ground operations represented significant investments in infrastructure that demonstrated Arthur's commitment to maintaining permanent Brotherhood presence rather than conducting temporary raids or reconnaissance missions. The relationships that the Brotherhood developed with various Commonwealth factions during their initial period of operations reflected Arthur's synthesis of traditional Brotherhood doctrine with pragmatic approaches to alliance and blocking cooperation that had been learned through decades of successful operations in the capital wasteland. The alliances that were formed and the conflicts that emerged from these early diplomatic efforts would influence the organization's long-term position in the region and determine whether their expansion would proceed through cooperation or conquest. The combat operations that Brotherhood forces conducted throughout the Commonwealth during their first months of deployment demonstrated the effectiveness of combining the Pridwen's mobility and coordination capabilities with ground-based units equipped with advanced weapons and power, armor, creating tactical advantages that enabled them to achieve objectives that would have been impossible through conventional approaches. The successful elimination of various threats and the recovery of valuable technological artifacts validated Arthur's decision to commit significant resources to the Commonwealth expedition. The technological discoveries that Brotherhood scribes made during their investigation of Commonwealth facilities provided insights into pre-war research programs that had continued operating after the Great War, creating both opportunities for advancement and concerns about the implications of such uncontrolled development. The Institute's synthetic human program and the various automated systems that had been operating independently for decades represented exactly the kind of unregulated technological development that Brotherhood doctrine was designed to prevent or control. The moral complexities that arose from Brotherhood operations in the Commonwealth tested Arthur's ability to balance the organization's traditional focus on technological preservation with humanitarian concerns that had been influenced by his education under Elder Lyons and his own observations of wasteland conditions. The decisions that were required regarding synthetic humans, automated defense systems, and civilian populations caught in various conflicts required judgments that went beyond simple application of established doctrine. The evolution of Arthur's leadership approach during the Commonwealth campaign reflected his growing confidence in his ability to synthesize competing priorities and interests while maintaining the essential characteristics that made the Brotherhood effective as both a military organization and a force for technological advancement. The policies that he developed for dealing with various Commonwealth situations established precedents that would influence Brotherhood operations for generations, while demonstrating his ability to adapt traditional approaches to novel circumstances. The uncertainty that surrounded the ultimate outcome of Brotherhood operations in the Commonwealth reflected the complex and dynamic nature of the political and technological challenges that Arthur and his forces encountered, as multiple possible futures remained viable depending on the decisions that would be made by various participants in the ongoing conflicts. The success or failure of the expedition would determine not only the Brotherhood's position in the region, but Arthur's own legacy as a leader who had either successfully expanded the organization's influence or overextended their capabilities beyond sustainable limits. The stage was set for the final test of Arthur Maxson's leadership and the ultimate validation or repudiation of his vision for the Brotherhood's future. As the youngest elder in the organization's history, faced challenges that would determine whether the name that had guided them since their founding would continue to provide effective leadership in a world where the stakes had never been higher and the margin for error had never been smaller. And so we reach the end of our chronicle, fellow wanderer, at the threshold where history becomes possibility and legend transforms into choice. 4 generations of Maxsons have carried the torch of the Brotherhood through the long darkness of the post-war world, each bearing the weight of their ancestors' dreams and mistakes. From Roger's betrayal by the old world to Arthur's confrontation with the new, the name has been both blessing and burden, shield and target, inspiration and obligation. Whether Arthur Maxson represents the culmination of his family's destiny or its tragic conclusion remains unwritten in the stars above the Commonwealth. The blood of founders flows in his veins, but the future demands choices that no amount of heritage can dictate. In the end, perhaps that is the truest legacy of the Maxson family, not the certainty of succession, but the courage to forge new paths when the old ones lead only to shadow. Rest now, and dream of steel and honor, of families bound by duty and torn by circumstance, of names that echo through time like prayers whispered in irradiated winds. The Brotherhood endures, whether the blood of its founders flows through one last heir or lives on only in the ideals they died to protect. Sleep well, child of the wasteland. Tomorrow's choices await.